You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com, and this may also be found on Rudolf Steiner Audio, which is located at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com as a podcast. This is a little cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Christ and the Spiritual World, The Search for the Holy Grail, translated by Charles Davy and D.S. Osmond, and there are 6 lectures. This is number 1 of 6, entitled Christ and the Spiritual World. Many people who are naturally fitted to receive anthroposophy in our present age will find it necessary to clear away various contradictions that may arise in their minds. In particular, the soul can be brought up against a certain contradiction when it wants to take seriously the memories of such a season of festival as that which includes Christmas and the New Year. When we take these memories seriously, then it becomes clear to us that at the same time as we try to gain knowledge, we must penetrate into the spiritual history of mankind if we are to understand rightly our own spiritual evolution. We need only take a certain thought, and we shall find it on the one hand full of light, while on the other it makes us disturbingly aware of how contradictions, difficulties, must pile up before the soul of anyone who wants to accept, in the right sense, our anthroposophical knowledge concerning man and the evolution of the world. Among the varied forms of knowledge that we try to reach through our anthroposophical studies, we must of course include knowledge of the Christ, knowledge of the fundamentally important impulse, we have called it the Christ impulse, which came in at the beginning of our era. And we are bound often to ask ourselves how we can hope to penetrate more effectively, with deepened anthroposophical knowledge, into the course of human evolution, in order to understand the Christ impulse, than those who lived at the time of the mystery of Golgotha were able to do. Was it not much easier for them to penetrate into this mystery, whose secret is specially bound up with the evolution of humanity, than it is for us at this great distance in time? That might be a troublesome question for persons who want to seek an understanding of Christ in the light of anthroposophy. It might become one of those contradictions which have a depressing effect just when we want to take most earnestly the deeper principles of our anthroposophical knowledge. This contradiction can be cleared away only when we call up before our souls the whole spiritual situation of humanity at the beginning of our era. If we try, at first without any kind of religious or similar feeling, to enter into the psychic disposition of man at that time, we can make a most peculiar discovery. We can say to ourselves that we will rely on what cannot be denied, even by minds most given over to externals. We will draw on the old tradition as found in history, but we will try to penetrate into that part of it which embraces the purest spiritual life. In this way, we may hope to lay hold of essential elements in the evolution of humanity. Let us, therefore, try to enter quite historically into the endeavors that were made by men, say 200 years before the mystery of Golgotha, and 150 years after it, to deepen their thinking in order to understand the secrets, the riddles of the world. Then we realize that during the centuries before and after the mystery of Golgotha, a change of far-reaching significance occurred in the souls of men with regard to the life of thought. We find that a large part of the civilized world received the influence of that which Greek culture and other deepened forms of thinking had achieved some centuries previously. When we consider what mankind had accomplished in this way by its own efforts, not in response to any impulse from without, and how much had been attained by men called sages in the Stoic sense, and a good many personalities in Roman history were so ranked, then we are bound to say, these conquests in the realm of thought and ideas were made at the beginning of our era, and Western life has not added very much to them. We have gained an endless amount of knowledge concerning the facts of nature, and have been through revolutions in our ways of thinking about the external world. But the thoughts, the ideas themselves, through which these advances have been made, and with which men have tried to discern the secrets of existence in external spatial terms, have really developed very little since the beginning of our era. They were all present, even those of which the modern world is so proud, including the idea of evolution, in the souls of that period. What might be called an intellectual laying hold of the world, a life of ideas, had reached a certain summit, and not only among particular individuals, such as the pupils of Socrates a little earlier. It had become popular in a limited sense and had spread widely over southern Europe and other regions. This deepening of thought is truly astonishing. An impartial history of philosophy would have to pay special attention to this triumph of human thinking at that time. But if we now take these highly significant advances in the realm of ideas, and on the other hand the secrets bound up with the mystery of Golgotha, we become aware of something different. We realize that as the story of the event on Golgotha became known in that age, an immense wrestling of thought with that mystery occurred. We see how the philosophies of the period, especially the Gnostic philosophy in its much profounder form, struggled to bring all the ideas it had gained to bear on this one purpose. And it is most important to let this struggle work upon us, for we then come to recognize that the struggle was in vain, that the mystery of Golgotha appeared to human understanding as though it were dispersed through far distant spiritual worlds and would not unveil itself. Now, from the outset, I would like to say that when in these lectures I speak of the mystery of Golgotha, I do not wish to invest this term with any coloring drawn from religious traditions or convictions. We shall be concerned purely with objective facts that are fundamental to human evolution, and with what physical and spiritual observation can bring to light. I shall leave aside everything that individual religious creeds have to say about the mystery of Golgotha, and shall look only at what has happened in the course of human evolution. I shall have to say many things which will be made clear and substantiated later on. In setting the mystery of Golgotha by the side of the deepest thought of that time, the first thing that strikes one is what I expressed by saying, the nature of this mystery lies far, far beyond what can be reached by the development of thinking. And the more exactly one studies this contrast, the more is one brought to the following recognition. One can enter deeply into the thought world that belongs to the beginning of our era. One can try to bring livingly before one's soul what thinking meant for those men of Greece and Rome. One can call up before one's soul the ideas that sprang from their thinking. And then one comes to the feeling, yes, that was the time when thought underwent an unprecedented deepening. Something happened with thought. It approached the human soul in a quite new way. But if then, after living back into the thought world of that time, and recreating it in one's soul, one brings clairvoyant perception to bear on this experience, then suddenly something surprising emerges. One feels that something is happening far, far away in the spiritual worlds, and that the deepening of thought is a consequence of it. We have already called attention to the fact that behind our world lie other worlds, the astral, the devachanic, and the higher devachanic. Let us first remind ourselves that these three worlds lie behind our own. Then, if the clairvoyant state of soul is raised to full activity within oneself, the impression is received that neither in the astral world nor in the lower devaconic world can a complete explanation of the deepening of thought at that time be found. Only if one could place one's soul in the higher devaconic world, so says clairvoyant insight, would one experience what it is that streams through the other two worlds and penetrates right down into our physical world. On this physical plane, there is no need to be aware, while steeping oneself in that past world of ideas, of anything told concerning the mystery of Golgotha. One can leave that quite out of account and ask simply, no matter what happened over there in Palestine, what does external history indicate? It shows that in Greece and Rome an infinite deepening of thought took place. Let us put a circle round this Greek and Roman thought world and make it an enclosed island, as it were, in our soul life, an island shut off from everything outside. Let us imagine that no report of the mystery of Golgotha has reached it. Then, when we inwardly contemplate this world, we certainly find there nothing that is known today about the mystery of Golgotha, but we find an infinite deepening of thought, which indicates that here in the evolution of humanity something happened, which took hold of the innermost being of the soul on the physical plane. We are persuaded that in no previous age and among no other people had thinking ever been like that. However skeptical anyone may be, however little he may care to know about the mystery of Golgotha, he must admit one thing, that in this island world that we have enclosed, there was a deepening of thought never previously known. But if one places oneself in this thought world, and has a clairvoyant faculty in the background, then one feels truly immersed in the individual character of this thought. And then one says to oneself, yes, as this thinking flowers into idea with Plato and others, as it passes over into the world we tried to enclose, it has a quality which sets the soul free, which lays hold of the soul and brings it to a loftier view of itself. Whatever else you may apprehend in the external world or in the spiritual world makes you dependent on those worlds. In thinking, you take hold of something which lives in you, and which you can experience completely. You may draw back from the physical world. You may disbelieve in a spiritual world. You may refuse to know anything about clairvoyant impressions. You may shut out all physical impressions. With thoughts, you can live in yourself. In your thinking, you lay hold, as it were, of your own being. But then, and it cannot be otherwise if one enters with clairvoyant perception into this sea of thought, as I might call it, a feeling of the isolation of thought comes over one. A feeling that thought is still only thought, that it lives first of all only in the soul, and that one cannot draw from it the power to go out into a world where the ground of the rest of our being, the ground of what else we are, is to be found. In the very moment when one discerns the grandeur of thought, one discerns also its unreality. Then one can see also how in the surrounding world that one has come to know through clairvoyance, there is fundamentally nothing to sustain thought. Then why should thought be there at all? The physical world can do nothing but falsify it. Those who wish to be pure materialists, who refuse to ascribe to thought any primal reality of its own, should really prefer to prohibit it. For if the natural world is the only real world, thought can only falsify it. It is only because materialists are illogical that they do not embrace the only theory of cognition that goes with monistic materialism, the refrain from thinking, think no more theory. But to anyone who immerses himself with clairvoyant perception in the world of thought, there comes this disquieting awareness of the isolation of thought, as though he were standing quite alone with it. And then only one thing remains for him, but it does remain. Something comes toward him, even though it be from a far spiritual distance, separated from him by two worlds. And it becomes apparent, so the clairvoyant soul says to itself, that in this third world lies the true origin, the fountainhead of that which is in the life of thought. For clairvoyant souls in our time, it could be a powerful experience to immerse themselves, alone with their thinking, in the time when thought underwent its deepening, to shut out everything else, including knowledge of the mystery of Golgotha, and to reflect how the thought content on which we still nourish ourselves came forth in the Greco-Roman world. Then one should turn one's gaze to other worlds, and feel rising over the Devaconic world a star that belongs to a higher spiritual world, the star from which rays out the power that makes itself felt in the thought world of Greco-Roman antiquity. Then one feels oneself here on earth, but carried away from the world of today and plunged into the Greco-Roman world, with its influence spreading out over other regions at that time, before the mystery of Golgotha. But as soon as one lets the spiritual world make its impression on one, there appears again, shining over Devacon, the star, I speak symbolically, or the spiritual being of whom one says to oneself, yes, the experience of the isolation of thought, and of the possibility of thought having undergone such a deepening at the beginning of our era, this is a consequence of the rays that shine out from this star in the higher spiritual world. And then comes a feeling which at first knows nothing of the historical tradition of the mystery of Golgotha, but can be expressed thus. Yes, you are there in the Greco-Roman world of ideas, with all that Plato and others were able to give to the general education of mankind, with what they have imparted to the souls of men. You feel yourself living in the midst of that. And then you wait, and truly not in vain, for as though deep in the background of spiritual life appears the star which sends forth its rays of power. And you can say that what you have experienced is a result of that power. This experience can be gone through, and in going through it, one has not relied on any kind of tradition, but has quite impartially sought the origin of what took place in the Greco-Roman world. But one has also had the experience of being separated by three worlds from understanding the root causes of the Greco-Roman world. And then, perhaps, one turns to the men of that time, who tried in their own way to understand the change. Even the external scholarship of today has come to recognize that in this period of transition, at the beginning of our era, some religious philosophic genius has lived. And they can best be encountered by looking at Gnosticism. The Gnosis is known in the most varied ways. Externally, remarkably little is really known about it, but from the available documents one can still get an impression of its endless depth. We will speak of it only insofar as it bears on our present considerations. Above all, we can say that the Gnostics had a feeling for what I have just described, that for the causes of what happened in that past epoch, one must look to worlds lying infinitely far away in the background. This awareness was passed on to others, and if we are not superficial, we can, if we will, see it glimmering through what we may call the theology of Paul, and in many other manifestations also. Now, anyone who steeps himself in the gnosis of that period will have great difficulty in understanding it. Our souls are too much affected and infected by the fruits of the materialistic developments of the last few centuries. In tracing back the evolution of the world, they are too readily inclined to think in terms of the Kant-Laplace theory of a cosmic nebula, of something quite material. And even those who seek for a more spiritual conception of the world, even they, when they look back at the beginning of time, think of this cosmic nebula or something similar. These modern people, even the most spiritual, feel very happy when they are spared the trouble of discerning the spiritual in the primal beginnings of cosmic evolution. They find it a great relief, these souls of today, when they can say to themselves, quote, "This or that rarefied form of material substance was there to start with, and out of it everything spiritual developed side by side with everything physical." Close quote. And so we often find souls who are greatly comforted when they can apply the most materialistic methods of inquiry to the beginning of the cosmos, and arrive at the most abstract conception of some kind of gaseous body. That is why it is so difficult to enter into the thoughts of the gnosis. For what the gnosis places at the beginning of the world carries no suggestion of anything at all material. Anyone thoroughly attuned to modern education will perhaps be unable to restrain a slight smile if he is invited to think, in the sense of the gnosis, that the world in which he finds himself, the world he explains so beautifully with his Darwinism, bears no relation to a true picture of how the world began. Indeed, he will hardly be able to help smiling when he is asked to think that the origin of the world resides in that cosmic being who is beyond all concepts, not to be reached by any of the means that are applied nowadays to explaining the world. In the primal divine Father, says the gnosis, lies the ground of the world. And only in what proceeds from him do we find something to which the soul can struggle through if it turns away from all material conceptions and searches a little for its own innermost depth. And this is silence, the eternal silence in which there is neither space nor time, but silence only. It was to this duality of the primal Father and the silence preceding time and space that the Gnostic looked up, and then from the union of the primal Father with the silence, as it were, he conceived other existences proceeding. One can equally well call them worlds or beings. And from them others, and again others, and again others, and so on through 30 stages. And only at the 30th stage did the Gnostic posit a condition prior to our present mentality, a condition so delightfully explained by Darwinism in terms of that mentality. Or, strictly speaking, at the 31st stage, for 30 of these existences, which can be called worlds or beings, precede our world. In quotes, eon is the name generally given to these 30 beings or worlds that precede our own. One can get a clear idea of what is meant by this eon world only by saying to oneself, to the 31st stage, there belongs not only what your senses perceive as the external world, but also the way in which your thinking, as physical man, tries to explain the sense world. It is easy enough to come to terms with this spiritual conception of the world if one says, yes, the external world is certainly Maya, but with thinking we penetrate into a spiritual world. And if one hopes that this thinking really can reach the spiritual world. But according to the Gnostic, this is not so. For him, this thinking belongs to the 31st eon, to the physical world. So not only sense perception, but human thinking lies outside the 30 eons, who can be looked up to through the stages of spiritual evolution, and who reveal themselves in ever-mounting perfection. One can easily imagine the smile that comes to a monist standing at the summit of his time, if he is asked to believe in 30 preceding worlds, 30 worlds with a content entirely different from anything his thinking can conceive. But that was the view of the Gnostics. And then they asked themselves, how is it with this world? we will disregard for a while what we have ourselves said about the world in the sense of the early 20th century. What I am now telling you must not be taken as offering a convincing world picture. In the anthroposophy of the 20th century, we have naturally to get beyond the gnosis. But just now, we want to sink ourselves in it. Why is this surrounding world, including the human faculty of thinking about it, shut off from the 30 eons? We must look, said the Gnostic, to the lowest, but still purely spiritual eon. And there we find the divine Sophia, the divine wisdom. She had evolved in a spiritual way through the 29 stages. And in the spiritual world she looked up to the highest eon through the ranks of spiritual beings or worlds. But one day, one cosmic day, it became evident to her that if she was to maintain a free vision into the spiritual world of the eons, she had to separate something from herself. And she separated from herself that which existed in her as desire. And this desire, being no longer present in the divine Sophia, the divine wisdom, now wanders through the realms of space and permeates everything that comes into being in the realms of space. Desire does not live only in sense perception, but also in human thinking and in the longing that looks back to the spiritual world, but always as something cast out into the souls of men. As an image of the divine Sophia cast out from her, lives this desire, Achamad, thrown out into the world and permeating it. If you look into yourselves without raising yourself into spiritual worlds, you look into the desire-filled world of Achamad. Because this world is filled with desire, it cannot disclose within itself that which is revealed by looking out into the world of the eons. Far, far away in the world of the eons, so thought the Gnosis, the pure spirituality of the eons engenders what the Gnostics called the Son of the Father God, and also what they called the pure Holy Spirit. So we have here another generation, as it were, another evolutionary line, different from that which led to the divine Sophia. As in the propagation of physical life, the sexes are separate, so in the progression of the eons, another stream took its origin from a very high level in the spiritual world, the stream of the Son and the Holy Spirit, stemming from the Father. So, in the world of eons, there was one stream leading to the divine Sophia, and another to the Son and the Holy Spirit. If one rises through the eons, one comes eventually to an eon from whom there arose on the one hand the succession leading to the divine Sophia, and on the other the succession leading to the Son and the Holy Spirit. And then we ascend to the Father God and the divine silence. Because the human soul is shut off with Achamad in the material world, it has, in the sense of the Gnosis, a longing for the spiritual world, and above all for the divine Sophia, from whom it is separated through being filled with Achamad. This feeling of being separated from the divine, of not being within the divine, this feeling is actually experienced, according to the Gnostic, as the material world. And the Gnostic sees, originating from the divine spiritual world, but bound up with Achamad, what one might call, to borrow a Greek word, the demiurgos, the cosmic architect. This demiurgos is the real arch-creator and sustainer of that which is permeated with Achamad and the material. The souls of men are woven into his world, but they are imbued also with longing for the divine Sophia. As though in the far distance of the eon world appear the Son and the Holy Spirit in their pure divine spirituality, but they appear only to someone who has, in the sense of the Gnosis, raised himself above everything in which is embodied Achamad, the desire that pervades space? Why is there this longing in the souls that have been drawn into the world of Achamad? Why, after their separation from the divine spiritual world, do they feel a longing for it? The Gnostics also asked themselves these questions, and they said, Achamad was cast out from the divine wisdom, the divine Sophia. But before Achamad had completely become this material world where men now live, there came to her something like a brief raying out of light from the Son of God. And then immediately the light vanished again. For the Gnostic, this was an important concept, that Achamad, the same Achamad that lives in the souls of men, had been granted, in the primal remote past, a glimpse of divine light, which had then immediately disappeared. But the memory of it lives on today in human souls, however deeply enmeshed in the material world the soul may be. Quote, I live in the world of Achamad, the material world, close quote, such a soul might have said. Quote, I am surrounded with a sheath drawn from the material world, but when I sink into my inner being, a memory comes to life within me. The element that holds me bound to the material world longs after the divine Sophia, the divine wisdom. For the being of Achamad, which lives in me, was once illuminated by a ray from the Son of God, who dwells in the world of the eons. Close quote. We should try to picture clearly to ourselves such a soul as this, a disciple of the Gnosis. There were such souls. They were not a hypothetical invention. Anyone who studies history with understanding will come to realize, through the external documents, that many souls of this kind lived in that period. We need to see clearly why there are such strong objections nowadays to what I have been saying. What will a thoroughly level-headed man of today have to say about the Gnosis? We have already had to listen to the view that the theology of Paul gives an impression of rabbinical subtleties, far too intricate for a sensible monist to concern himself with. A monist who looks out proudly over the world and draws it all together with the simple concept of evolution, or with the still simpler concept of energy, and says, quote, now at last we have grown up. We have acquired the ideas which give us a picture of the world based on energy. And we look back at these children, these poor dear children, who centuries ago built up the Gnosis out of childishness. They imagined all sorts of spirits, 30 eons. That is what the human soul does in its time of nursery play. The grown-up soul of today, with its far-reaching monism, has left such fancies far behind. We must look back indulgently at these Gnostic infantilisms. They are really charming. Close quote. Such is the prevailing mood today, and it is not easily teachable. One might say to it, yes, if a Gnostic, with his soul born out of the Gnosis, were to stand before you, he might also take the liberty of expressing his outlook somewhat like this, quote, I understand very well how you have become so proud and arrogant with your ideas of evolution and energy. But this is because your thinking has become so crude and simple and primitive that you are satisfied with your nebula and your entirely abstract concepts. You say the words evolution and energy and think you have got something, but you are blind to the finer spiritual life that seeks its way up into that which rises through 30 stages above anything you have. Close quote. But for us, the antithesis mentioned at the beginning of this lecture becomes all the sharper. We see on the one hand our own time, with its crude and primitive concepts, and on the other the Gnosis. And we have seen how the Gnosis employs endlessly complicated concepts, 30 eons, in order to find in the course of evolution the Son of God and the Holy Spirit, and to find in the soul the longing for the divine Sophia and the Holy Spirit. and we ask ourselves, is it not from the deepening of thought in the Greco-Roman world that we have gained what we have carried so splendidly far in our thoughts about energy and evolution? And in this gnosis, with its complicated ideas, so unsympathetic to the present day, are we not looking at something quite strange? Are not these colossal contrasts? Indeed they are. And the contradiction, lying like a weight on the soul, becomes ever greater if we reflect on what was said about clairvoyant souls. That they can transpose themselves into the thought world of the Greeks and Romans, and then see the world with the star of which we have spoken. And mingled everywhere with this deepening of Greek thought, we find that other deepening which the gnosis exemplifies. Let me read that sentence again. And mingled everywhere with this deepening of Greek thought, we find that other deepening which the gnosis exemplifies. Yet when we look at this with the aid of what anthroposophy should give us today, and are yet powerless to understand what the star should signify, separated as we are from it by three worlds. And if we ask the Gnostics, have you understood what happened at that time in the historical evolution of humanity? Then, standing on the ground of anthroposophy, we cannot take the answer from the Gnostics, for it could never satisfy us. It would throw no light on what is shown to the clairvoyant soul. It is not my wish that you should treat our considerations today as offering an explanation of anything. The more you feel that what I have told you is not an explanation, the more you feel that I have put before you contradiction after contradiction, and have shown you only one occult experience, the perception of the star, the better will you have understood me for today. I would wish you to see clearly that at the beginning of our era there appeared in the world something which influenced human understanding and was as yet far, far from being understood. I would like you to feel that the period at the beginning of our era was a great riddle. I want you to feel that in human evolution there happened something which seemed at first like a deepening of thought or a discovery of thought, and that the root causes of this are a profound enigma. You must seek in hidden worlds for that which appeared in the Maya of the physical sense world as a deepening of Greco-Roman thought. And it is not an explanation of what we have heard, but the setting out of a riddle that I wish to give you today. We will continue tomorrow. The end of Lecture 1. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. If you are listening to this as a podcast, it is Rudolf Steiner Audio, located at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. And if you'd like to be a supporter, please consider being a patron. This is a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Christ and the Spiritual World, The Search for the Holy Grail. And it is translated by Charles Davy and D.S. Osmond. This is Lecture 2. If we call to mind once more the thoughts of yesterday's lecture, we can draw them together by saying that the period at the beginning of our era took all possible pains to understand the mystery of Golgotha out of the treasure of its wisdom, and that this endeavor encountered the very greatest difficulties. We must pause to consider this, for unless we are clear about this inevitable misunderstanding of what came about through the mystery of Golgotha, we shall not be able to comprehend an essential fact of later centuries, the advent of the Grail idea, concerning which we shall have something to say in connection with our subject. When we recall the beginning of our era and look at its most significant wisdom-filled current of thought, when we look, that is, at the Gnostics, then on the one hand we can see in the light of yesterday's lecture how grandly original were the ideas with which they sought to place the Son of God in the center of an imposing world picture. But if, on the other hand, we look at what can be learned about the mystery of Golgotha from the spiritual chronicle of the time, then we must say that no real truth can be had from the concepts and ideas of the Gnostics. And this is particularly evident when we consider the various ways in which the Gnostics pictured the manifestation of the Christ in Jesus of Nazareth. There were some Gnostics who said, quote, "Yes, the Christ is a being who transcends everything earthly and comes from spiritual realms. Such a being can remain for only a limited time in a human body, as was the body of Jesus of Nazareth." Close quote. These Gnostics had discerned something which today we must emphasize again and again, that in truth the Christ being dwelt for 3 years only in the body of Jesus of Nazareth. But these Gnostics went wrong over the way in which the Christ being dwelt in the body of Jesus. First of all, the mystery of the body of Jesus of Nazareth was not clear to them. They did not know that the ego Zarathustra had lived in this body, that the 3 bodies of Jesus of Nazareth represented in their conjunction an essence of humanity which had never before been incarnated in the flesh on earth. The whole relation of the Christ to the 2 Jesus boys was hidden from these Gnostics. Footnote, see, among others, the following references in lecture courses by Dr. Steiner, titled The Gospel of St. Luke, notably lectures 4 to 7, titled The Gospel of St. Matthew, notably lecture 6, titled The Spiritual Guidance of Man and of Mankind, titled Deeper Secrets of Human History in the Light of St. Matthew's Gospel. End of footnote. Hence, they were never satisfied, or at least their followers were never satisfied, with what they could say about the temporary inhabiting of the body of Jesus of Nazareth by the Christ. Another question touched on by the Gnostics was the manner of the birth of Jesus, of Christ, the most tremendous mystery in human evolution. They knew well enough that the necessary reason for the appearance of Christ on earth is connected with the passage through conception in the flesh. But they could not quite see how to bring the mother of Jesus into relation with the birth of Christ. And those who tried to work this out, there were some, were very little understood. Again, there were Gnostics who, because of these various difficulties, denied entirely that the Christ had appeared on earth in bodily form. They formed the idea that it was only a phantom body, what we should call an astral body, which had gone about on earth before and after the death on Golgotha. It had appeared here and there, but it was not a physical body. Because of the difficulty of conceiving how the Christ could have been united with a physical body, it was said that no such union had occurred, and that when people thought he had gone about in a physical body, this was illusion, Maya. This notion, too, gained no recognition. So we can see everywhere that the Gnostics tried to master with their concepts the greatest historical mystery in the earth's evolution. But their ideas were inadequate, powerless in face of what had actually occurred. Now we must speak of the way in which Paul tried to come to terms with the problem. But first it will be well to grasp clearly how it was that such misunderstandings were inevitable. If with the help of spiritual investigation we ask ourselves a series of questions and try to answer them, the course of events will become apparent to us in, one might say, an abstract form. For example, we can ask, if the epoch of Christ Jesus was so poorly equipped to understand his nature, would another epoch have been in a position to understand him? If, as a spiritual investigator, one enters into the souls of men at different periods of the past, one certainly comes to a strange result. First of all, one can enter into the souls of the great teachers of the ancient Indian civilization, the first of the post-Atlantean culture epochs. There, as we have often emphasized, we stand with deepest admiration before the comprehensive, deeply grounded wisdom, permeated throughout with clairvoyant vision, of the holy Indian rishis of that ancient time. We know that the souls of these great teachers were open to cosmic mysteries, which were lost to the wisdom knowledge of later times. And when one tries to enter clairvoyantly, as well as one can, into the soul of one of these great teachers of ancient India, one must say that if it had been possible for the Christ being to have appeared on earth among the holy rishis at that time, their wisdom would have been in the highest degree capable of understanding the nature of Christ. Then there would have been no difficulties. They would have known what it was all about. And since one cannot properly express, in abstract words, such significant phenomena as those I have just described, let me evoke a picture. If the holy rishis of ancient India had perceived in a man the splendor of the wisdom of the Logos, the wisdom that pulses through the world, they would have brought to the Logos their offering of frankincense, symbolizing a recognition of the divine that works in the realms of humanity. But the Christ being could find no body at that period. The bodies of that time would not have been suitable for him, so he could not appear. The reasons for this will be given later, in the epoch when all the means of understanding were present. If we go further and enter into the souls of the old Zarathustrian civilization, we can say, these souls were certainly not endowed with the high spiritual resources of the old Indian civilization, but they would have understood that the Sun Spirit had elected to live in a human body, and they would have been able to grasp the significance of this fact in relation to the Sun Spirit. To speak pictorially again, the disciples of Zarathustra would have honored their Sun Spirit with an offering of shining gold, the symbol of wisdom. If we go further still into the Chaldean Egyptian culture epoch, we find that the possibility of understanding Christ Jesus would have again decreased, but it would not have narrowed down as far as it did in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, the Greco-Latin epoch, when even the Gnosis was not powerful enough to understand this manifestation. It would have been understood that a star from spiritual heights had appeared and had been born in a human being. This divine spiritual line of descent from spheres beyond the earthly would have been clearly grasped, and myrrh would have been brought as an offering. And if we enter into the souls of those who figure in the Bible as the three magi, who come from the east, and are the guardians of the treasures of wisdom derived from the three preceding culture epochs, we find the Bible itself indicating that a certain understanding was present, since these three magi do at least appear at the birth of the Jesus child. One thing that very few people think about today will certainly strike us, that the Bible is in a strange position with regard to the three magi. For it does not wish to say that there were three men of exceptional wisdom who even at the time of the birth understood its significance. Let me read that again. For does it not wish to say that there were three men of exceptional wisdom who even at the time of the birth understood its significance? But one might ask, where were the three wise men later on? What came of their wisdom in the end? Have we anything that could lead us back to an understanding of the Christ manifestation by way of these three wise men? This must be thrown out only as a question. It is one of the many questions which must certainly be put to the Bible, and which will be more significant than all the pedantic Bible criticism of the 19th century. When we come to the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, we can say of it, now there is present a body in which the Christ can incarnate. It was not there in the preceding epochs, but now it is there. In this fourth epoch, however, men lack the possibility of finding their way to a real understanding of what is happening. Indeed, a strange paradox, is it not? For the fact that confronts us is actually this: that Christ appeared on earth in an epoch that was least adapted to understanding him. And when we look at all the attempts that were made in subsequent centuries to understand the nature of Christ Jesus, we find endless theological wrangling. And finally, in the Middle Ages, a sharp distinction is drawn between knowledge and faith, which implies a complete abandonment of any knowledge about the being of Christ Jesus. Not to speak of modern times, which up to the present have remained powerless in face of this manifestation. A truly remarkable phenomenon. The Christ was born in the very epoch that was least adapted to understanding him. And if in the evolution of humanity the essential thing had been for Christ to work on the understanding of human souls on earth, then one must say it, this working would have been in a sad way. One might perhaps call that putting it very strongly, but in order not to be misunderstood, I want to say this. To anyone who looks from the standpoint of spiritual science at the history of theology in relation to the Christ event, it must seem as though theology had deliberately set out to place one hindrance after another in the way of understanding the Christ being. For theological erudition seems to take a course which leads it farther and farther away from this understanding. That is radically expressed, but anyone ready to enter into this way of putting it will be able to grasp the deeper meaning of my words. Now, fundamentally speaking, it is certainly not easy to unravel the riddle I have been speaking of, and I avow that in the course of time I have tried to come near it through the most varied ways of spiritual research. Obviously, there is not time to speak of these ways now, but there is one way among the many that I should like to mention. It is the way that leads round at the beginning of our era through a very remarkable manifestation of spiritual life, the life of the Sibyls. These Sibyls were indeed a remarkable phenomenon with a prophetic character entirely their own. External scholarship cannot say from which language the word Sibyl comes. As soon as we start looking at the fairly detailed knowledge about the Sibyls that external documents provide, we come upon something quite extraordinary at the very beginning of the Sibylline age. From about the 8th century BC onward, we encounter the first abode of the Sibyls in Ionian Erythrea. From there, the first Sibyls sent out into the world their manifold prophecies. And these prophecies, even in the form handed down by external tradition, show that they arose from strange subconscious regions of human nature and soul life. As though out of chaotic psychic depths, the Sibyls utter all kinds of prophecies about the future development of this or that people, telling many of awful things to come, but sometimes also of good things. Far removed from anything like orderly thought, the utterances of the Sibyls pour out in such a way that if they are studied with the means of spiritual science, it seems, as one listens, that every Sibyl is a spiritual fanatic who wants to force upon people what she has to say. She does not wait to be questioned in the manner of the Greek Pythian oracle. She steps forth, the people assemble, and her utterances about men and peoples and earth cycles seem to ring out with overbearing force. It is remarkable, as I said, that the Sibyls should appear first in Ionia, for Ionia was at the same time the birthplace of Greek philosophy, the wisdom which from Thales and Aristotle on into the Roman epoch is so preeminently an expression of a well-ordered soul life, entirely opposed to anything chaotic. It draws forth from the soul life all that can be expressed in clear, lucid, light-filled concepts. From Ionia sprang the philosophy of clarity and light, which, with Plato, one might say, became the philosophy of the heavenly. And like its shadow appear the Sibyls, with their psychic products emanating from the chaos of the soul, often shedding a true illumination on the future, but also often announcing things which their followers had to falsify in order to make it seem that the prophecy had been fulfilled. And then we see further how the Sibyls, always accompanying the fourth culture epoch like a shadow of its wisdom, spread through Greece, through Italy. We hear tell of the most varied kinds of sibyls, and we see symbolism spreading on through Italy until we come to the time of the mystery of Golgotha. Then we see how symbolism gains influence over the Roman poets, how it even plays into the poems of Virgil, how it is just the intellectuals who try to shape their lives by appealing to the sayings of the sibyls. How much importance was attached to these sayings is shown by the so-called Sibylline books, which were turned to for guidance. And again, in the external world, we see how, in connection with the Sibylline sayings, great intelligence is chaotically mixed up with errant humbug. And then we see Sibyllism even gaining a foothold in Christianity. We hear its voice in Thomas of Celano's hymn, footnote, Day of wrath, O day which leads this world age into destruction, according to the witness of David and of the Sibyl. Close quote. And so, right into the time of the development of Christianity, many minds were aware of the Sibyls and their prophecies, especially those that bore on doom and destruction and the coming of a new world order. Hence one can say that through many, many centuries, indeed all through the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, and with an influence extending, if only sparsely, into the fifth epoch, the Sibyls are encountered in the history of mankind. Only someone dominated by present-day rationalistic ideas can overlook the far-reaching influence of Sibyllism on the world in which Christianity grew up. As I have often said, the history we are given to read is in many respects a fable convenue, especially where anything of a spiritual nature is concerned. Until quite recent centuries, the ideas of all classes of people were influenced much more widely than is generally believed by what came from the Sibyls. Sibyllism is a remarkable enigmatic phenomenon, occurring as it did in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch. What really went on in the souls of the Sibyls must be of interest to us, for through spiritual research we must unearth such things from beneath the layer of materialistic culture which covers them nowadays. In this condition they are useless. They must be brought to light and renewed by the resources of spiritual research which are available in our epoch. But attention must also be drawn to the fact that in comparatively recent times the nature of Sibyllism was not forgotten to the extent it is today. We have indeed an important work of art which points to the traditions concerning the significance of Sibyllism. Perhaps we do not always look at this work with an awareness of its significance in this respect, but the significance exists and should give occasion for reflection. I mean the great paintings in the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo depicted not only the development of earth and humanity, but also the prophets and the Sibyls. And in looking at these paintings, we ought to notice the way in which Michelangelo portrays the Sibyls, and particularly how he contrasts them with the prophets. In this contrast, if we look at it impartially, we find something which, through spiritual science, we can recognize as having to do with various hidden aspects of the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, during which the mystery of Golgotha was fulfilled. In this wonderful work of art, we see first the portrayal of the prophets, Zechariah, Joel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah, Jonah. And ranged with them are the Sibyls, the Persian, Delphic, Erythraean, Libyan, and Cumaean Sibyls. Almost all the prophets, we find, have to a greater or lesser degree something of the character which strikes us immediately in Jeremiah and comes out with particular significance in Zechariah. They are deeply reflective men, for the most part absorbed in books or something similar, quietly taking into well-ordered minds whatever it is they are studying. In the countenances of these prophets we encounter the calmness of their souls. Daniel looks like a slight exception, but only an apparent one. He stands before a book which is supported on the back of a boy. He has in his hand something to write with. in order to write down in another book what he is reading. Here there is a slight effect of transition from reading the world's secrets to writing them down, while the other prophets remain in meditation, calm and relaxed in soul, entirely devoted to the world's secrets. In gazing at them we see, and this must be kept firmly in mind, that they are all absorbed in super-earthly things. Their souls are at rest in the spiritual, and they are seeking to fathom the emergence of humanity from out of the spiritual. We see that in their thinking they are far removed from their immediate surroundings, far above human passion and fanaticism, untouched by the ecstasy that may spring from these emotions. They are not only beyond human ken, but beyond anything a human being can experience in himself, insofar as he is a man on earth. That is the greatness of this portrayal of the prophets by Michelangelo. Then we turn our gaze to his depiction of the Sibyls. Here we have first the Persian Sibyl, close to the prophet Jeremiah, contrasting remarkably with his meditative demeanor. She raises her hand as though wishing to force on humanity what she has experienced, as though, in the style of a bad speaker, she wants to add all possible emphasis to her words, as though impelled by the passion of a fanatic to impose with imperious gesture her message on all mankind. Then we turn to the Erythraean Sibyl. We see how she is connected with everything that can accrue to man from the elemental secrets of the earth. Above her head is a lamp. A naked boy is lighting the lamp with a torch. How could the intention of the painting be more clearly expressed? Here is human passion kindling out of the unconscious soul forces the message that is to be instilled with all the power of prophecy into mankind. The prophets are devoted in their souls to the primal eternity of the Spirit. The Sibyls are carried away by the earthly, insofar as the earthly reveals the psychic spiritual. The Delphic Sibyl shows this particularly clearly. We see how her hair is even blown to one side by a gust of wind, and the same wind catches her blue veil, so that she has the air element to thank for what she imparts. In this gust of wind we see pictured what the earth wished to reveal through the lips of this Sibyl with forcibly persuasive power. Then the Cumaean Sibyl. She speaks with half-open mouth, as though muttering, as though stammering out a prophecy from the unconscious, the unknown. The Libyan Sibyl, the hasty one, looks as though she is turning round to grasp something from which secrets can be read, something like that. In these Sibyls everything is devoted, so to speak, to the immediate element of earth. Much was entrusted to images of this kind in the days when, as we can readily understand, things could be much more effectively expressed in paintings and other forms of art than they would be in our time, when concepts and ideas are more to the purpose. What then is the special character of these Sibyls? What are they? What does their prophesying signify? We must penetrate deeply into the mysteries of human evolution if we want to fathom what went on in the souls of these Sibyls. With this aim in view, let us ask again, why would it have been so easy for the old Indian rishis, with their scarcely conceivable wisdom, to understand Christ Jesus? It seems trivial, yet it is true to say, because they had the necessary concepts and gifts of wisdom, and in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch these were lacking. They had everything for which the Gnostics and the anti-Gnostics and the Apostolic Fathers, all, as they were called, thirsted in vain. They had it all. But in what form did they have it? Not as ideas that had been worked out, somewhat as the ideas of Plato and Aristotle were worked out, but as inspirations, as something that stood before them with the full power of concrete inspirations. Their astral bodies were laid hold of by that which streamed into them from the great universe. And out of this working of the cosmos on their astral bodies came the concepts which could have conjured up before their souls the being of Christ Jesus. One might say that this was given to them. They had not worked it up for themselves. It came as though showered forth from the depth of the astral body. And with wonderful clarity it showered upon the holy rishis and their pupils, and fundamentally speaking upon the whole Indian culture of the first post-Atlantean epoch. It became more and more narrowed down, but in the second and third post-Atlantean epochs it was still there, and the remains of it passed over into the fourth epoch. But what was this remainder? If we were to examine what things were like in the third post-Atlantean epoch, we should find that at least those who had raised themselves to the height of their epoch, and proportionately there were many more spiritually developed persons than there are today, had ideas about the interconnections of the super-earthly and the symbolic significance of the starry heavens. They could read world secrets in the motions of the stars. It is quite certain that the third post-Atlantean epoch, if Christ had appeared on earth then, would have known from the writings in the stars what relationship it had with him. But in accordance with the principle we have often mentioned with regard to the evolution of humanity, it was necessary that the gift of entering into relation with the mysteries of the world through living pictures should recede more and more into the background of the astrality of man. These pictures became increasingly chaotic. That which flowed by this channel into the human soul became less and less authoritative. I am not saying that it lost all authority, but it became less and less authoritative as a means of fathoming the real mysteries of the universe. And so two quite different developments can be traced. On the one hand, there was the world of concepts, let us say of Plato and Aristotle, a world of ideas which could be called the most attenuated form of the spiritual world, a world which had in it the least of spirit, a world grasped and explored directly by the ego and no longer experienced through the astral body. For that is the distinguishing mark of Greek philosophy. There, for the first time, the spirit spoke out of the ego, as it can do in concepts that were perfectly lucid, but far removed from real spiritual life. But the Greek philosopher still felt that his thoughts emanated from the spiritual world, whereas a modern philosopher is by necessity a doubter, a skeptic, because he no longer feels any connection between his thoughts and the mysteries of the world. In modern times there has been a decline in the faculty for saying, when I think, the world spirit is thinking in me. As I have tried to show entitled The Threshold of the Spiritual World, it is necessary to gain through meditation a little of that confidence in the forming of concepts and ideas which came naturally to the Greek philosopher, because he was able to accept his thoughts as thoughts of the world spirit itself. Only the outermost fringe of the world spirit approached humanity through Greek philosophy, but it was a fringe, permeated with the actual life of the world spirit, and this was felt to be so. The second element which persisted from older times was atavistic, an heirloom, and it persisted most plainly in the prophecies of the Sibyls. Out of the chaos of their inner life, they brought forth once more the human soul forces, which had worked harmoniously during the second and third post-Atlantean epochs, and now gave confused glimpses of the spiritual world. Let us take an hypothesis, which in our present context is perhaps permissible. What would have happened if neither the Christ nor Greek philosophy had come into the world? Humanity would then have had to get along with what it had received as inheritance from the past. And in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, this had reached the stage of Sibyllism. Imagine this developing on its own lines in the West, without the Christ impulse and without philosophy, and without the science that followed philosophy. Then you will have a picture of the spiritual chaos that would have overtaken the West, arising inevitably from all that had been active in the souls of the Sibyls. But forces have after effects. If with the resources of spiritual science one examines this elemental strength, through which the spiritual powers connected with wind and water and fire find expression in the immediate circumference of the earth, and if one studies how these powers would have found an abode in human souls, especially if one tests the strength with which the spirits of wind and fire, water and earth would have taken possession of the souls of men, then one can see how harmony and order had faded out of the old way of knowing the world, prevalent during the first 3 post-Atlantean epochs, and how the forces only would have remained in human souls. Human souls would have lost the capacity for relating themselves truly to the great phenomena of the cosmos, but they would have assuredly had a relation with the spirits of wind and water, fire and earth, and particularly with the whole tribe of specters and demons which would have got loose from their cosmic connections. Men would have fallen quite under the sway of the elemental spirits. Their teachers would have been of the Sibylline kind, and the force would have been so strong that it would have persisted right up to the present, and indeed up to the very end of earth days. And if we ask why this has not happened, and who has brought it about that the force so apparent in the Sibyls has gradually declined, then we must answer, the Christ, who through the mystery of Golgotha infused the earth's aura with his being. Thus he destroyed the Sibylline force in the souls of men and has driven it away. And so on the ground of spiritual science, we observe the remarkable fact that men, with their wisdom, have not understood much about the Christ impulse. Their concepts and ideas have turned out to be virtually powerless in this respect. But the essential thing is not that the Christ impulse came into the world primarily as a teaching. The essential thing is the character of the facts, the direct impulse that flowed from the mystery of Golgotha. And this we must look for not only in what is taught or understood, but in what is accomplished for human souls. And one of these deeds, the struggle waged by Christ, who had permeated the earth aura against Sibyllism, it is this deed that I wished to bring before you today. Thus the Christ had in fact to fulfill the office of a judge. This was misunderstood by those who took it materialistically, to imply that Christ would return soon after his resurrection. Human concepts at that time could not reach to an understanding of these things. But in the chaotic ideas of an early return, there was the truth that there had been this early manifestation of Christ. He had manifested on ground which, as we shall see tomorrow, had been prepared externally by Paul. But above all, he had manifested in the region behind the sense world, where the spiritual conflict between Christ and the Sibyls had been waged. We must pierce the veil that shows us the spreading of Christianity on the physical plane. We must look behind the physical plane at the spiritual conflict, whereby the souls of men were freed from that chaotic element which would otherwise have gone on from strength to strength. And this fact is seen in a false light by anyone who fails to comprehend that through this supra-physical deed something of endless value was accomplished for mankind by the Christ. But who were they who achieved at least something, indeed much, toward this comprehension? They were the writers of the Gospels, and Paul, who were endowed with a certain inspiration or revelation from the spiritual world. We shall have to appreciate from other points of view the emergence of the evangelists and of Paul. But we can now see how Paul stands in the midst of a world where something is going on beyond the reach of his words, beyond all that he could contribute through his powerful, fiery words toward an understanding of the mystery of Golgotha. And yet, particularly if one grasps the nature of the struggle waged by the Christ against the Sibyls, one has a feeling about Paul that I would like to sum up in a few concluding words. With Paul, it always seems that there is much more between his words than one gets from simply reading them. It is as though the Damascus vision had come to expression through him, as though there penetrated into humanity through him a note which was opposed to the prophetic note of the Sibyls, as though through him there rang out again the note of the old prophets, whom Michelangelo has represented so beautifully in his paintings. As I have said, the Sibyls had something that came from the elementals of the earth, something that could not have been there if the elemental spirits of the earth had not spoken to them. With Paul there was something similar, something which external scholarship has noted in a remarkable but quite exoteric way. And this, if one examines it from the standpoint of spiritual science, really leaves one standing before a world of amazement. Paul also, in a certain way, created something out of the elemental nature of the earth, but in a distinctive region of the earth. Naturally, one can understand Paul quite well in a theological, rationalistic, abstract way, if one leaves out of account what I am going to say, for this cannot be explained in terms of external science. One can understand Paul quite well if one wants to understand him only from the standpoint of ordinary rationalism. But if one wants to grasp what it was that lived spiritually in Paul, in and between his words, and why one feels through his words something akin to the prophecies of the Sibyls, but with him proceeding from a good element in earth evolution, then one comes to the phenomenon which answers the question, how far does Paul's world extend? What are its boundaries? And the remarkable answer we receive is, Paul is great throughout the world where the olive tree is cultivated. I know I am saying something strange, but we shall see that this strangeness explains itself in a certain sense when tomorrow we enter a little into the character of Paul. Geographically, too, the world is full of secrets, and the region of the earth where the olive tree flourishes is different from the regions where flourish the oak or the ash. Man, as a physically embodied being, has a relationship with the elemental spirits. In the world of the olive tree, the rustle and movement, the whisper and gesture, are not the same as in the world of the oak or the ash or the yew. And if we want to grasp the connection of the earth nature with human beings, we need to pay attention to such peculiar facts as this. The fact that Paul carries his message just as far over the earth as the domain of the olive tree extends. The world of Paul is the world of the olive tree. The end of Lecture 2. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. As well, you may be listening to Rudolf Steiner Audio at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com, which is the podcast of this file. And if you would like to support the podcast, consider being a patron. This is a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Christ and the Spiritual World, The Search for the Holy Grail. And it was translated by Charles Davy and D.S. Osmond, and this is Lecture 3. These lectures are so arranged that separate themes will be introduced, and then I shall bring in considerations which will lead toward the themes and throw light upon them. One theme, accordingly, resides in what was said about the difficulty of understanding the being of Christ Jesus. Then we came to the significance of the prophecies of the Sibyls, as illustrating one side of human soul life during the fourth post-Atlantean epoch. Finally, at the close of yesterday's lecture, I introduced the theme of Paul and the olive tree. I will return to these leading themes, but we must approach them, as it were, in circles, with our themes inscribed at the center. What is really meant by the themes will then gradually emerge. Today I would like to say something about the Christ being as such. We shall then see how in Paul The Christ being is reflected in a certain definite way. From earlier lectures, we know that the Christ being can be understood if we follow the evolution of our system back to the old sun existence. And on various occasions, in lectures already published, attention has been drawn to the fact that in the Christ being, we have to do with a high spiritual being. That is the term we will use for the present, for whose own evolution the old sun period was especially important. I will not go further into that just now. We will simply look up to the Christ being as a high spiritual being. But for understanding human evolution, something else is necessary, and we have seen how necessary it is for, in relation to a certain fact, the concepts and ideas which, in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, aspired to understand the being of Christ, were powerless to do so. Again and again, especially during the early centuries, among the Gnostics, among the Apostolic Fathers, and among the persons who contributed in one way or another to the founding of Christianity, this question came up. How was the nature of Christ related to the nature of Jesus? Now, we already know that we have to distinguish two Jesus boys. Of one of these we need not speak further here, for he can be readily understood but from previous anthroposophical explanations. I mean the Jesus in whom lived the ego of Zarathustra. Here we have a human being who, in the second post-Atlantean epoch, had already reached a high degree of evolution, who at that time founded the Zarathustrian spiritual stream, and then had subsequent lives, who later reincarnated in the Solomon Jesus child, and in him, up to his 12th year, underwent the development appropriate for so lofty an ego in that period. We know also that the Zarathustra ego passed over into the body of the other Jesus child, on whose nature the Luke Gospel throws some gleams of light. We must now consider a little this Nathan Jesus child. I have already drawn your attention to the fact that in this child we have not to do with a human being, like other human beings, in the strict sense of the term. We cannot say of this being that he had previously been incarnated on earth in this or that individual. We have always emphasized that of the soul element which has come forth from spiritual worlds in order to live in single individuals on earth, something, as it were, remained behind, and that what had thus remained behind appeared in the Nathan Jesus child. Hence, of this child we cannot say that in him there lived an ordinary human ego, which had developed in a certain way through earlier incarnations. We have to recognize, this follows from what is said in my book, titled Occult Science and Outline, that he had not previously walked the earth as man. The only question is, did this being, whom we will now call simply Jesus of Nazareth, have any previous connection with earth evolution? Footnote, see lecture given by Dr. Steiner in Pforzheim, 7/3/1914, entitled Pre-Earthly Deeds of Christ, end of footnote. We must remember that the beings and powers connected with human evolution are not confined to those who incarnate on the earth itself. There are also spiritual beings and powers who belong to the higher hierarchies. If, therefore, we say that something of the substance which divided itself among single human souls remained behind, and was then in a certain sense born in the Nathan Jesus child, we are not saying that this being had no previous relation with earth evolution. We are saying only that he was not related to the evolution of the earth and of humanity in such a way as to have walked the earth as man. We must look for him not in the history of the physical earth, but in pre-earthly spiritual realms. And then, for the kind of observation I have often spoken about, clairvoyant observation, the following is revealed. Let us recall what is described in Title Occult Science, how from the Lemurian age onward, souls gradually came down from the other planets, with the exception of one principal human pair who had stayed on Earth. and were incarnated in human bodies throughout Atlantean times. We must accordingly think of Earth evolution as being such that the souls withdrew from the Earth's cosmic surroundings, and at various points of time took up again their evolution on Earth. We know that before the Lemurian age, they had gone away to other planets. But we know also that the evolution of the Earth had been exposed to the attacks of Lucifer, and later to those of Ahriman. Thus the souls of men had to enter into bodies wherein they were exposed, in the course of human evolution, to the attacks of both these spiritual beings. If nothing further had come about, if, that is, the human souls had come down from planetary existence into evolution on Earth, there to encounter the Luciferic and Ahrimanic influences, then something else would have happened to them as they went through subsequent incarnations. Something I did not intimate in occult science, for at the present day one cannot say everything in public. First of all, when the human beings came down from the planets into physical bodies, the development of their senses would have been exposed to a certain danger. We must not think it was a quite simple matter for these human souls to come down from their planetary abodes and assume bodies on Earth, and that after that everything went on normally. Because the Luciferic and Ahrimanic principles held sway in these bodies, they were not so organized as to enable human beings to pursue the course of evolution, which in fact they did pursue. If these souls had simply gone on using the forces which governed the sense organs of these bodies, they would have had to use their senses in a peculiar way, a way not really human. For example, the eye, EYE, would have been so impressed and affected by a color that it would have felt itself permeated with intense feeling. At the sight of one color, it would have positively glowed with pleasure. For another color, it would have felt intense, painful antipathy. And so, because of the Luciferic and Ahrimanic influences, the souls descending from the planets would have found no bodies equipped with senses of the right kind. They would have been tormented by sympathy and antipathy. On seeing one color or another, they would have been seized with bliss or repulsed with acute pain, all through their lives. That was how evolution was going. Cosmic forces, especially those from the sun, would have worked on the earth in such a way as to give the senses this character. Any contemplation of the world, in a spirit of quiet wisdom, would have been ruled out. So a change had to be brought about in the forces which flowed from the cosmic environment into the earth, and had built up the senses of man. In the spiritual world, something had to happen so that these forces would not turn the senses into mere organs of sympathy and antipathy, for they would then have been under the sway of Lucifer and Ahriman. Hence the following took place. The being of whom we have said that he had not chosen the path down from the planets to the earth, but had remained behind, the being who later appeared as the Nathan Jesus child, and who had dwelt from primal ages in the spiritual worlds, this being resolved, if we may use this expression, for of course all these expressions are taken from human speech and cannot fully convey what one wants to say, while still in the world of the higher hierarchies, it resolved to go through a development which would enable him to be permeated for a time by the Christ being. Thus we have to do not with a man, but with a superhuman being, who, if we may speak in this way, lived in the spiritual world, and as it were heard the distress of the human sense system crying out to the spiritual world for help, and in response to this cry made himself fitted to be permeated by the Christ. So it was that in the spiritual worlds, the being who later became the Nathan Jesus child was permeated by the Christ being, and then brought about a change in the cosmic forces which were streaming in to build up the human senses. These senses were changed in such a way that instead of being mere organs of sympathy and antipathy, they became organs that human beings could use, and so could look with wisdom at all the nuances of sense perception. Very differently would the cosmic forces have flowed into mankind if this event, far back in the Lemurian age, had not taken place in the spiritual worlds. This being who appeared as the Nathan Jesus child was then still living, if I may use the phrase, in the sun sphere. And because he listened to the human cry of distress, he experienced something which made it possible for him to be permeated by the very spirit of the sun, S-U-N, so that the activity of the sun was modified in such a way that the human sense organs, which derive essentially from solar activity, did not become organs of mere sympathy and antipathy. Here we touch upon a significant cosmic secret, and one which will enable us to understand much that happened later on. A certain order and harmony imbued with wisdom could now flow into the realm of the human senses, and evolution could go on normally for a while. The worst activity of Lucifer and Ahriman had been turned away from the human senses by a deed in the higher worlds. Later on came a time in the Atlantean age when it once more became apparent that the human bodily constitution could not be a suitable instrument for the feeling and willing. If nothing further had happened, these soul organs would have become disordered. I mean that willing would have been continually disturbed by thinking, feeling would have interfered with willing, and so on. Men would have been condemned, as it were, to a perpetually chaotic use of these soul organs. They would have been maddened by an excess of will, or confused by repressed feeling, or there would have been people plagued with fleeting ideas through a hypertrophy of thinking, and so forth. This was the third great danger to which humanity was exposed on earth. Now these three soul powers, thinking, feeling, and willing, are coordinated from the surroundings of the earth, for the earth itself is essentially the scene of action for the ego. The working together of thinking, feeling, and willing has to be kept in order, not, however, from all the planets, but only from sun, moon, and earth, so that through the interworking of sun, moon, and earth, if this is harmonious, man is made fit for the harmonious cooperation of his three soul powers. Help for these soul forces had to be provided from the spiritual world, and now the soul of that being who later became the Nathan Jesus child assumed a cosmic form such that his life was in a sense neither on the moon nor on the sun, but as though it circled the earth and felt a dependence on the influences of sun, moon, and earth at the same time. The earth influences came to him from below, the sun and moon influences from above. Clairvoyant observation really sees this being in the springtime of his evolution, if I may use that phrase, in the same sphere as that in which the moon goes round the earth. Hence I cannot say exactly that the moon influence came to him from above, but rather that it came to him from the place where he was, this pre-earthly Jesus being. Again there rose to him a cry of distress, a cry that told of what human thinking, feeling, and willing were on the way to becoming. And he sought to experience completely, in his own inner being, this tragedy of human evolution. Thereby he called to himself the high sun spirit, who now for the third time descended upon him, permeating him. So in the cosmic height beyond the earth, there was a third permeation of this Nathan Jesus child by the high sun spirit, whom we call the Christ. Now I would wish to depict for you this third ensouling rather differently from the way in which I described the other two. That which took place through these successive stages of spiritual evolution, or heavenly evolution, I would say, was reflected in the various world outlooks of the post-Atlantean peoples. For it had effects which worked on into later times. The sun's activity continued to be influenced by the fact that in ancient Lemurian times, the being who afterward became the Nathan Jesus child had been permeated by the Christ being. And the essential thing about the initiation of Zarathustra was that he perceived the activity of the sun impregnated with this influence. In this way, his teaching arose. His initiation had revealed to him, had projected into his soul, what had happened in primeval times. The third post-Atlantean epoch, which we call the Egyptian Chaldean epoch, came about partly through the reflection in human souls, as a continuing human experience, of the activities that had originated from the permeation by the Sun Spirit of the Nathan Jesus being, while that being was journeying round the planets. From this arose that science of planetary activities which comes before us in Chaldean astrology. People today have a very meager conception of what it really was. Among the Egyptian Chaldean peoples of the epoch, there developed also that star worship which is indeed known exoterically. It arose because the moderating of planetary influence was still making itself felt at that later time. Later still, in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, we can see in Hellenism a reflection of planetary spirits who had, as it were, come into existence, because the being who had been permeated by the Christ journeyed from planet to planet, and on each planet became one or other of these spirits. On Jupiter he became the one whom the Greeks later called Zeus. On Mars the one later called Ares. On Mercury the one later called Hermes. In the Greek planetary gods there was this later reflection of what Christ Jesus in the supersensible worlds had made of the planetary beings who were imbued with the Luciferic and Ahrimanic principles. When a Greek looked up to his heaven of the gods, he came into touch with the adumbrations, the reflections of the activity of Christ Jesus on the individual planets, together with much else that I have described. To this was added as a third event the reflection or adumbration of that which the Jesus being in the later post-Atlantean times had experienced as a celestial being in relation to sun, moon, and earth. If we are to characterize this, we can say the Christ ensouled himself in an angelic being. We say of Christ that he embodied himself in Jesus of Nazareth. But we are speaking now of an event that took place in spiritual worlds. The Christ ensouled himself, in quotes, in an angelic being. And the effect was that human thinking, feeling, and willing took an orderly course. This was an important event, coming early in the evolution of humanity. The development of the human soul powers was brought into good order. The two earlier Christ events had brought order rather into the bodily constitution of man on earth. What then had to happen in the celestial worlds for this third event to come about? It will be easier to recognize this third event if we look for the reflection of it in Greek mythology. For just as the planetary spirits projected themselves into the figures of Zeus, Ares, Hermes, Venus, or Aphrodite, Kronos, and so on, so was this third cosmic event reflected not only in Greek mythology, but in the mythologies of the most diverse peoples. We can understand how it was reflected if we allow ourselves to compare the reflected images with their sources. If, that is, we compare what happened in Greece with what first happened in the cosmos. What was it that happened up there in the cosmos? The need was to drive out something which would have raged chaotically in human souls. This had to be overcome. The angelic being, who was permeated with the Christ, had to accomplish the deed of vanquishing and driving out from the human soul that which had to be driven out if thinking, feeling, and willing were to be harmonized. And so there arises the picture, let us bring it vividly before our souls, of an angelic being dwelling still in the spiritual worlds, who later became the Nathan Jesus child. He appears to us ensouled by the Christ, and thereby rendered capable of special deeds, able to drive out from thinking, feeling, and willing the element which would have raged within them as a dragon and brought them into chaos. A reminiscence of this is preserved in all the pictures of St. George vanquishing the dragon, which are found in the records of human culture. St. George and the dragon reflect that celestial event when the Christ ensouled the Jesus being and enabled him to drive the dragon out of the soul nature of man. This was a significant deed, made possible only with the help of Christ in the being of Jesus, at that time an angelic being. For this angelic being had actually to connect himself with the dragon nature, to take on, as it were, the form of the dragon, in order to hold off the dragon from the soul of man. He had to work from within the dragon, so that the dragon was ennobled and brought out of chaos into a kind of harmony. The training, the taming of the dragon, that is the further task of this being. And so it came about that the dragon indeed remained active, but because there was poured into him the influence and power of the being I have described, he became the bearer of many revelations, which proved their worth to human civilizations throughout the course of post-Atlantean evolution. Instead of the chaos of the dragon manifesting in maddened or bewildered men, the primal wisdom of the post-Atlantean time came forth. Christ Jesus used the dragon's blood, as it were, so that with his help it could transfuse human blood and thereby make human beings the vehicles of divine wisdom. A significant reflection of this is apparent, even quite exoterically, in Greek mythology from the 9th century BC onward. It is remarkable how, for the Greek mind, one particular divine figure emerged from the others. The Greeks, we know, reverenced a variety of gods. These gods were the reflections or projections of the beings who originated from the journey round the planets of the being permeated by the Christ, who later became the Nathan Jesus child. The Greeks saw them in such a way that when they looked out into cosmic spaces, when they looked up through the light ether, they rightly ascribed to the planet Jupiter, in an inward, spiritual, not an external sense, the origin of the being they spoke of as Zeus. So they spoke of Pallas Athena, of Artemis, of the various planetary gods who were the reflections of what we have spoken about. But from these pictures of the various figures of the gods, there emerged one figure, the figure of Apollo. The figure of Apollo emerged in a distinctive way. What did these Greeks see in him? We come to know Apollo if we look at Parnassus and the Castalian spring. To the west of it, there was a cleft in the earth, and over this the Greeks built a temple. Why? Vapors used to rise up out of the cleft, and when the air currents were right, the vapors crept up the mountainside like the coils of a snake, like a dragon. And the Greeks imagined Apollo as shooting his arrows at the dragon, as it rose from the cleft in the form of turbulent vapors. Here in the Greek Apollo, we see an earthly reflection of St. George, shooting his arrows at the dragon. And when Apollo had overcome the dragon, the python, a temple was built, and instead of the dragon, we see how the vapors entered into the soul of the Pythia, and how the Greeks imagined that Apollo lived in these swirling dragon vapors and prophesied to them through the oracle, through the lips of the Pythia. And the Greeks, that self-conscious people, rose through the ages for which their souls had been prepared. Rose through the stages for which their souls had been prepared. They accepted what Apollo had to say to them through the Pythia, who was imbued with the dragon vapors. It meant that Apollo lived in the dragon's blood and filled men with wisdom from the Castalian spring. And the place became a meeting place for the most sacred plays and festivals. Why was Apollo able to do this? Who was he? It was only from spring to autumn that he caused wisdom to flow up from the dragon's blood. Toward autumn he went away to his ancient home in the north, in the Hyperborean land. Farewell festivals were held at the time of his departure, and his return was welcomed in the spring. A deep wisdom resides in this idea of Apollo going north. The physical sun withdraws toward the south. In a spiritual sense, it is always the opposite. The story shows that Apollo has to do with the sun. Apollo is the angelic being of whom we have spoken. He was a reflection, projected into the Greek mind, of the angelic being who had, in fact, worked at the end of the Atlantean time, and who had been permeated by the Christ. This reflection was the Apollo who spoke wisdom to the Greeks through the mouth of the Pythia. And what was the content for the Greeks of this Apollo wisdom? We might say it was everything that led them, on the most important occasions, to take this or that decision. Again and again people went to Apollo at difficult moments in their lives, with their souls well prepared, and received prophetic guidance from the Pythia, who was stimulated by the vapors in which Apollo lived. And Asclepios, the healer, is for the Greeks the son of Apollo, the healing god. The weakened form of the angel in whom Christ once dwelt is a healer on earth, or for the earth. For Apollo was never physically embodied, but he worked through the earth elements. And the god of the muses, above all the god of song and the art of music, is Apollo. Why is this? Because through the power of song and string music he brings thinking, feeling, and willing into harmony. We have only to keep firmly in mind that in Apollo there was a projection of what had happened at the end of the Atlantean time. Something had then worked from spiritual heights into the human soul, and a weak echo of it could be heard in the musical art cultivated by the Greeks under the protection of Apollo. They knew it as an earthly reflection of the ancient art which the angel beings, permeated by the Christ, had cultivated in the heavenly heights, in order to bring thinking, feeling, and willing into harmony. They did not say so openly. Only in the mysteries was the meaning of it understood. In the Apollonian mysteries it was said, a high divine being once sank himself into a being of the hierarchy of angels, and thereby brought harmony into thinking, feeling, and willing. The art of music was a reflection of that happening, especially the Apollonian art, which flowed from the sound of strings. The music which demands less of the elements than wind instruments do, which depends in the main only on the skill of human hands, in short, the music that sounds from the strings of Apollo, to this music the Greeks ascribed the musical effects which bring harmony into the soul. And persons who have no inclination for Apollo's music, or do not value it highly enough, were said by the Greeks to carry a bodily mark of their obtuseness in this respect, a sign that they had stayed behind, atavistically, at an earlier stage. It is remarkable that when a certain man, King Midas, was born with exceptionally long ears, the Greeks said that he had come into the world with ass's ears, because in his life before birth he had not rightly devoted himself to the influence of the being whom the Christ had infilled. Therefore, said the Greeks, he had ass's ears, and that was why he preferred wind instruments to string instruments. And when once a child was born who, so to speak, had no skin, he is known in mythology as the flayed Marsyas, the Greeks said it was because before his birth he had not paid heed to all that flowed from the angelic being. But that is how it looks to occult observation. Marsyas was not flayed in his lifetime, but before his birth, and it was then that his misdeed occurred. Many towns founded by the Greeks as colonies were named Apollonia, because the sites for them had been chosen after consulting the Pythia. The Greeks cherished their freedom and so were not politically united. But they had an ideal unity through the god Apollo, for whom a kind of confederation was founded later on. We see how the Greeks revered in the god they called Apollo the being of whom we have spoken. And we might say that in the being who truly corresponded to Apollo at the end of the Atlantean time, the Christ was ensouled. Who then was Apollo? Not the reflection revered by the Greeks, but Apollo himself, a celestial being who from the higher worlds poured out healing forces for the soul, paralyzing the Luciferic and Ahrimanic powers. These forces brought about in the human body an harmonious cooperation of brain, breath, and lungs with the larynx and the heart. And it was this that came to expression in song. For the right cooperation of brain and breathing with the speech organ and the heart is the bodily expression of harmony in thinking, feeling, and willing. The healer, the celestial healer, is Apollo. We have seen this being pass through 3 stages of evolution, and then the healer whom Apollo reflected was born on earth, and men called him Jesus, which in our language means, quote, he who heals through God, close quote. He is the Nathan, Jesus' child, the one who heals through God, Jehoshua Jesus. Now at this 4th stage, this being made himself ripe to be infilled with the Christ being, with the I. This came to pass through the mystery of Golgotha. For if this mystery had not been enacted, if the being whom we have allowed through cosmic ages had not given embodiment to the Christ, then in the course of later time, human souls would not have found bodies in which the ego force could come to necessary expression on earth. The ego had been brought to its highest stage in Zarathustra. The souls who had taken part in the evolution of the ego would never have found earthly bodies suitable for its further development if the mystery of Golgotha had not come to pass. We have now seen the 4 stages of harmonization: the harmonizing of sense perception, of the life organs, of thinking, feeling, and willing, and the harmonization in the ego, this last through the mystery of Golgotha. You have the connections between the being who was born as the Nathan Jesus child and the Christ being, and the way in which this was prepared. It is now possible, through that which is permissible to reveal in true anthroposophy, to understand this kind of growing together, belonging together of the Christ being and the human nature of Jesus. This is possible for us. And a healthy development of spiritual life in the future will depend on this, on it becoming possible for more and more people to grasp that which could not be grasped by the thoughts and ideas of the epoch in which the mystery of Golgotha was fulfilled. The end of Lecture 3. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. Also, you may be listening to this at the podcast Rudolf Steiner Audio, which is located at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. And if so, please consider becoming a patron. This is a reading of a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Christ and the Spiritual World, The Search for the Holy Grail. And it is 6 lectures, translated by Charles Davy and D.S. Osmond. This is Lecture 4. Yesterday we spoke of how preparation was made for that which had to come about for the evolution of humanity through the mystery of Golgotha. We spoke of the 3 permeations of a being of the higher hierarchies by the Christ, and in the wonderful emergence of the Greek Apollo, we found an echo of what had taken place at the end of the Atlantean time, as a far distant prefiguring of the mystery of Golgotha. Now we have to inquire how the effects of this are manifest in the evolution of mankind. It will first be necessary to say something about the basic characteristics of the world pictures which appeared in post-Atlantean times as the echoes or after effects of the threefold Christ event. For this, as we have seen, reached a certain conclusion at the end of the Atlantean age. Let us try to look more deeply into the fundamental characteristics of these world pictures. They arose as after effects in human souls of all that I described yesterday. These post-Atlantean world pictures are indeed the reflections of the threefold Christ event in the souls of post-Atlantean mankind. From this point of view, we need say only a few words about the first post-Atlantean epoch. We know that in terms of spirituality, it was the highest post-Atlantean epoch up to now, but that what the souls of the holy rishis and their disciples received from it was less penetrated by the mysteries of which I spoke yesterday. The first post-Atlantean world picture, to show a direct effect of the threefold Christ event, was that which arose from the Zarathustrian impulse. Now I must here remark in parenthesis that I shall have to introduce words which, because of the way they are used today, have a dry, abstract, even pedantic sound. But search as one may through the language, there are no other words available. And so I shall want to appeal to your souls to understand by these words something far more spiritual than anything they can signify for the arid scholarship of the present time. From the point of view relevant here, I should like to associate the Zarathustrian world picture with chronology, in quotes. It looks beyond the two beings, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, to the workings of time, Tsirvan Akarana. Not, however, the abstract time we think of today, but time viewed as a living, superpersonal being. From this being proceed the rulers of time. First of all, the Amshaspans, the spiritual beings who are symbolized in cosmic space by the signs of the zodiac. Through the number 6, or 12 if we reckon in their antipodes, they rule over the Izeds, who rank below them and are 28 to 31 in number. The Izeds are spirits of a lower kind, servants of the high time beings. They regulate the days of the month. The Zarathustrian consciousness looked at the wonderful harmony which works through forces and is symbolized numerically by all the relations and combinations which result from the interweaving of 28 to 31 with 12. It looked into all that streams into the world and resounds through it, because in the great world orchestra, the instruments sound harmoniously together in these numerical relationships. For the Zarathustrian world picture, this appears as the ordering and harmonizing principle in the cosmic order. I want to give only a hint of these relationships, and because in that which creates and nourishes itself in creating, in that which takes the world pictures into itself, absorbing them spiritually, and carrying them over to higher stages, because the Zarathustrian outlook sees in time, in quotes, something living and superpersonal, so, while spiritualizing the term, we may call this world picture chronology, in quotes, whereby we are led to think at once of the god Kronos, the regent of time. Then we come to the third post-Atlantean epoch. Yesterday I described it as the epoch in which knowledge was kindled in human souls by the forces which shone out from the stars, when the secrets of the world were no longer discerned only through the relations between the rulers of time and the supersensible, for these were becoming manifest in the realm of sense existence. In the courses of the stars, in the signature of their movements in cosmic space, men could now perceive how harmony and melody in cosmic happenings are brought about. This picture of the world I would like to call astrology. So chronology is followed by astrology. And everything that was disclosed by the true authentic chronology of Zarathustrianism, and by the true authentic astrology of the Egyptian and Chaldean mysteries, all this was activated by the secret influence which had come into the world through the threefold Christ event before the Atlantean catastrophe. And what followed in Greece, or in the Greco-Latin epoch? What I am now going to say applies not only to the Greek and Roman cultures, but also to all the other regions of Europe. Yesterday I tried to illustrate it through a single example, but it holds good, one might say, for all the West. Let us recall how the Greeks reverenced Apollo, the reflection of the Nathan Jesus child, as he had been at the time of the Atlantean time. As he had been at the end of the Atlantean time. It was out of the Hyperborean land, from the north, that Apollo came to the oracle at Delphi. Through the Pythia, in summer, he spoke the most important things that the Greeks wished to hear. In the autumn he returned to his Hyperborean land. We connected this journey of Apollo with the journeys of the sun, but it is the spiritual sun that speaks through Apollo, and the spiritual sun goes away to the north, while the physical sun goes to the south. The myths are seen to be endlessly full of wisdom if they are considered in the light of true occultism. But in revering Apollo, the Greeks did not look on the sun as his visible sign in the heavens. Apollo was not a sun god in this sense. For a god symbolized by the external sun, the Greeks had Helios. It was he who regulated the course of the sun in the sky. Even if we take only the physical sun into account, we find that its influence on earth life is not confined to the direct effects of its rays. The sun works in the first place through air and water vapor, and so through the vapors which, as we have seen, rise from the site of the Castalian spring and coil round the neighboring hillsides like a dragon, the dragon killed by the Greek St. George. The sun works in all the elements, and after it has worked into them, inoculated them, its activity plays out from them on to human beings, through the servants whom we call elemental spirits. In the elements, the sun spirit is actively alive, and this is the activity the Greeks saw in their Apollo. Thus, for the Greeks, Apollo was a sun god, but not the Helios who drove the chariot of the sun across the heavens, and to some extent regulated the times of the day. In Apollo, the Greeks saw the sun's activity in the atmosphere, and this activity they addressed as Apollo when they addressed it spiritually. And so it was with many gods and spiritual beings whom we find in the West. I would mention many, but we need point only to Wotan with his wild host rushing through the storm. What form, then, did the world picture, still echoing the threefold Christ event, take in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch? Again, I must make use of a pedantic, dried-out word. Astrology was followed by meteorology, chronology, astrology, meteorology. We have only to bring the logi into relation with the logos. And so let me, readers aside, so they are in order: chronology, astrology, meteorology. Okay, and the readers aside. But while all this was breaking in over the Western world, something else streamed into the whole post-Atlantean civilization. This too was an after echo of the threefold Christ event, but it came from quite another side. And this fourth element, running as though parallel to the meteorology of the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, is something I must again designate with a dry, pedantic word: geology. But I beg you once more to relate the logi to the logos. Geology, then, where do we encounter it? The development of the ancient Hebrew civilization will never reveal its particular secrets unless it is studied as geology, in our sense of the term. How do we first come upon the ranks of the Elohim, or upon the Yahweh God? We meet him first when he wishes to form into man something taken from the earth itself. He wishes to clothe with a new covering, an earth vesture, the part of man that has come down from earlier times, from Saturn, Sun, Moon. Yahweh is precisely the God who forms man out of the earth, that is, out of the forces and elements of the earth. Therefore the ancient Hebrew wisdom, since it professed the Yahweh God, had to become geology. And this teaching about man, that he is formed out of the forces of the earth, is geology. Is not the geological character of the ancient Hebrew teaching shown to us at once in the name of the first man, Adam, he who was formed out of earth? That is the significant point that we must keep before us. Among other peoples, the peoples with a meteorological world picture, let us say, the creation of man is spoken of quite differently, with the emphasis on his soul. In the Greek tradition, for example, we see Prometheus engaged in the forming of man. Athena lends her aid and causes a spark from spiritual heights to be united with man. Prometheus forms the soul in the symbolic likeness of a butterfly. The Yahweh God forms man out of earth. And he, the Yahweh God, having become in the course of his evolution the ruler of earth, breathes out of his own substance a living soul into man. So Yahweh unites himself through his breath with what he has formed out of earth. And he wishes to dwell in his offspring, in his living breath, in Adam and his descendants, those beings whom Yahweh considered it his task to clothe in earth. And now, to carry this further, let us try to call up before our souls everything we find handed down by the Bible from Hebrew antiquity itself. We know and have emphasized that the earth develops certain forces. Goethe and Giordano Bruno, among others, compare these forces to those of inbreathing and outbreathing in human beings. The earth does have forces of inbreathing and outbreathing, which bring about ebb and flow, the swelling and sinking of the waters. They are inner earth forces, but the same as those which guide the moon round the earth. In water effects, we encounter a manifestation of these earth forces. In this realm, the Bible shows us the deluge as another important event after the creation of Adam, the, quote, man of earth, close quote. And now let us pass on to the time of Moses. If we look at the doings of Moses in the right light, we find them constantly related to activities of the earth. Moses goes to the rocks with his rod and makes water gush out. Moses goes up the mountain. Above and below the mountain is connected with earth activity. For we must think of this mountain as a volcano, or at least as volcanic. It is not the Sinai generally imagined. The earth is active in it. The column of fire in which Moses stands is akin to what happens when we burn a piece of paper in the sulfur hills of Italy and smoke comes out. So does fiery smoke, telluric activity, come out of the mountain. And in telluric activity the Jews always saw symbols. In front of them went the pillar of cloud or of fire, telluric activity. We could go deeply into details, and everywhere we should find that the spirit of earth prevails in all that Moses gives out as a revelation of the Yahweh God. What Moses proclaims is geology. The profound difference between the Greek and the Hebrew conceptions of the world will never be understood unless it is recognized that the Greek conception belongs to meteorology and the Hebrew conception to geology. The Greeks felt that they were living in the midst of forces pouring in on the earth from the surrounding cosmos, pouring into the air and pervading the atmosphere. The Hebrews felt themselves in close relationship to forces rising from the earth below and bound up with the earth. Yes, even the sufferings of the Hebrew people come from the desert, where the earth forces prevail. Geology dominates the destiny of the Hebrews. Geology, expressed now in the fruitfulness of the earth, is what promised them, through the reports of their spies, to the promised land, Paul knew well that this consciousness of a connection with the earth spirit is a result of the pre-earthly Christ event, for he indicates that it was the Christ who led the Jews through the desert and caused water to flow from the rock. And if we were to go on from the Bible to some of the significant Hebrew legends, we should find them permeated with geology, in the sense meant here. Thus we are told how Yahweh, when he was forming man out of earth, sent forth an angel to gather earths of different colors from all parts of the earth, so that everything belonging to the earth should be mingled in Adam's bodily vesture. Today we should say that Yahweh took great care to place man on the earth so that in his true being he would be the highest flower, the crown of earthly creation. For the Chaldeans, the Egyptians, the Zoroastrians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the European peoples of Central and Northern Europe, the most important part of man was the part that came from the spiritual world. For the Jews, the most important element in man was connected with the earth and its forces. Yahweh felt himself as the God whose spiritual rulership prevailed throughout the earth. Thus we can regard as the most important event in the fourth post-Atlantean epoch the emergence of geology side by side with meteorology. And a wonderful spiritual reflection of this comes to expression in ancient Hebrew prophecy. What were these prophets really striving for? Let us try to look into the prophetic souls of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hezekiah, Daniel, Joel, Jonah, and Zechariah. If we do this quite impartially, without any preconceptions, we find that they were endeavoring, fundamentally, to bring a particular soul force into the forefront of the soul, and to drive another soul force down, as it were, into the depths. I have already asked you to notice how in the paintings of Michelangelo, which I described, the prophets are always depicted sitting there as if wrapped in deep thought, inwardly at rest, so that one sees how in the devotion of their souls they are connected through sub-earthly depths with the eternal. In contrast with them, Michelangelo places the Sibyls, who are open to the elemental powers of the earth. Thus the hair of one Sibyl is blown about by the wind, even her blue mantle billows in the wind, and under the influence of the wind she utters her prophecies. We see another Sibyl seized by inner fire. In the typically assertive gesture of her hand we see the fire, the earthly element. We could look again at these Sibyls one by one, and we should find that they live in the midst of the forces which play into their souls from the elemental surroundings of the earth. These Sibylline forces, which, so to speak, draw into their souls the spirit of the elements and bring it to expression, these are the forces that the old Jewish prophets wanted to repress. If you read impartially the whole history of the Jewish prophets, you will find that the prophet sets himself, and that is the aim of his training, to suppress in himself the Sibylline urge and to prevent it from ever breaking out. Apollo changed the Sibylline impulse of the Pythia by sinking himself into it and speaking through her. The prophets wanted to suppress everything Pythian in their souls, and to cultivate solely that which works in the clear force of the ego which is bound up with the earth and belongs to it, the ego which is the spiritual counterpart of the geological element. How the eternal reveals itself in the ego through calm repose, when the Sibylline elements are silent, when all inner turmoil ceases, when only calm prevails and gazes into the grounds of the eternal. That is what the Jewish prophets wished to manifest, so that their proclamations could spring from a temper of soul which corresponds in the highest degree with geology. Thus the stirring message that sounds forth to us from the prophets is like an outflowing of the geological element. And even when things turn out quite differently from what has been prophesied, this very fact shows us how closely bound are the prophets to the element of geology. a future kingdom which will redeem the existing kingdom, while remaining in all appearance an earthly kingdom, a heaven on earth. That is first of all what the prophets announce. So closely are they united with geology. This geological element in the prophets flowed on even into the early days of Christianity, since people expected not only the return of the Messiah, but that he would come down from the clouds and found his kingdom on earth. The distinctive inner character of Jewish culture will be understood only if it is taken in this sense as geology. This was what the prophets longed for and inculcated in their pupils, to suppress the Sibylline element, together with everything that leads the soul into unconscious depths, and to make manifest that which lives in the ego. The relations of all other peoples to their gods were different from those of the Jews to their Yahweh. The other relations were predetermined. They reflected the outcome of the relations of men to the spirits of the higher hierarchies during the Saturn, Sun, and Moon periods. The Jewish people had the task of developing a relationship which belonged specially to the earth period. But when the ego wishes to establish a relationship with its God, how does this find expression? Not as inspiration, so that morality springs from the operation of divine forces within the soul, but as commandment. The form of commandment found in the Decalogue is encountered first among the Jews. Whatever nonsense learned men may talk about earlier commandments, Hammurabi and so forth, I cannot go now into the follies of modern scholarship. The commandments that arise when the ego stands directly over against God and receives from God the rule, the precept, that the ego must follow out of its own inner will. This kind of commandment is met with first among the Jewish people. And it is here, too, that we first find God entering into a covenant with his people. The other gods worked with forces which are always connected with subconscious realms of the soul. Let us recall how Apollo worked through the Pythia, and how a person on his way to the Pythia had to prepare himself so that the god might be able to speak to him. Apollo spoke through the unconscious soul life of the Pythia. In contrast with this, we have the Yahweh God uttering his commandments, making a covenant with his people, speaking directly to the ego in the soul. And the prophets immediately wax wrath if something happens which did often happen to the Jewish people. Let me read that again. And the prophets immediately wax wrath if something happens which did often happen to the Jewish people, if the influence of heathen peoples gained sway over the Jews. No subconscious forces were to be allowed to influence the Jews. Everything had to rest on the alliance with God and the principle of the law. That was the especial concern of the prophets. And now let us look back a little, with the aid of occult knowledge, over what we have already tried to illustrate. Yesterday we came to know about the threefold Christ event, which took place in Lemurian and Atlantean times. We saw how on 3 occasions the being who appeared later as the Nathan Jesus child was permeated by the Christ, but in such a way that he did not incarnate on earth, but remained in spiritual worlds. And when we look back over what happened then, we must say that what was accomplished in Atlantean times flowed over into the East. For example, Elijah was one of the prophets, but in what sense is he a prophet? He is a servant of the God Yahweh, but in his soul an echo of the threefold Christ event lives on. In his soul is the knowledge, quote, as a prophet of Yahweh, I must above all things proclaim that in Yahweh there lives the Christ, who will later on fulfill the mystery of Golgotha. The Christ who poured his enduring influence into the cosmos through his third experience at the end of the Atlantean time. Close quote. Elijah proclaimed the Christ-filled Yahweh. For the Christ was indeed living in Yahweh, the Yahweh God, but as a reflection of himself. As the moon reflects the sunlight, so did Yahweh reflect the being who then lived as Christ. Christ caused his being to be reflected from Yahweh or the Yahweh God. But a messenger, such as Elijah, worked in the after effects of the threefold Christ event. We might say that Elijah went ahead of the Nathan Jesus being, who was passing spiritually from west to east, in order to find his way into the course of civilization, and then to be born as one of the Jesus children. The overflow, as it were, of meteorology, especially when this came into touch with geology, was felt by all peoples as a heralding of things to come. And we meet with the remarkable fact that in the region which afterward became so important for Christianity, one of these prefiguring signs occurred. We see how in the most varied places of Asia Minor, and also in Europe, festivals were held which were like foreshadowings of the mystery of Golgotha. The cults of Attis and Adonis have been correctly noted as having this character. But if we look at these festivals in their true light, we see that the event they prefigure is on the meteorological level. The God who was slain as Adonis and who rose again was not thought of as embodied in the flesh. What his worshippers had for a God was primarily an image, a picture. And in fact it was a picture of the angelic being who in spiritual heights was permeated by the Christ at the close of the Atlantean time, and was later born as the Nathan Jesus child. It was the destiny of the Nathan Jesus child that was celebrated in the worship of Adonis and Attis. We can now say that it was part of the karma of world history. You will perhaps look for something more behind these words. That in the place where the Bible with a certain truth locates the birth of the Jesus child, in Bethlehem, there was a center of the Adonis cult. Bethlehem was one of the places where Adonis had been worshipped. The Adonis who died and rose again was often celebrated there, and so was an aura prepared by the calling up of a memory. Once in the spiritual heights, there was a being who then belonged still to the hierarchy of angels and was later to come to earth as the Nathan Jesus child. A being who, at the end of the Atlantean time, had been permeated by the Christ. What had formerly been done for the harmonizing of thinking, feeling, and willing, this was celebrated at the Adonis festivals. And in Bethlehem, where Adonis festivals had been held, we have also the birthplace of the Nathan Jesus child. In conjunction, these words sound strange. But when we have sought out the threefold Christ event, the super-earthly event which on 3 occasions preceded the mystery of Golgotha, do we not see the Christ pass over from west to east, to the place where the mystery of Golgotha was to be fulfilled? Do we not see how he had sent his messenger in Elijah? And do we not know how in his next incarnation the messenger reappeared as John the Baptist? And are we not expressly told of this in a wonderful harmony of words? Quote, he sent his angel before him to herald his coming. Close quote. Footnote, quote, behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. Close quote. Malachi 3:1. Quote, for this is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. Close quote. Matthew 11:10. End of footnote. That can be said as well of John as of Elijah, or even better of Elijah, as will be understood by those who remember my saying that Elijah remained in spiritual heights and worked through a representative, so that he himself never went about on earth. If you reflect on that, the expression, quote, he sent his angel before him, close quote, is even more appropriate to Elijah than to John. Such messengers were always messengers of the Christ, who was passing from west to east. And now the geology of the Jews was to be permeated by the spiritual being whom we have learned to see as having a particular activity in relation to the earth. Geology was to be christened, German durchchristet. The spirit of the earth was to be experienced in a new way by men. They had to be enabled to free this spirit, in a certain sense, from the earth. But this was possible only if there came a power which could free the spirit of the earth from the forces of the earth. This happened when the earth's aura was permeated by the power of the Christ, and in consequence a change came over the earth itself. The Christ entered into the forces which the Yahweh God had released and gave them a different character. From all this, if we look back over it, we can understand why the laurel became a visible symbol of Apollo. For those who bring something of spiritual science to the study of the plant kingdom, the laurel has a strong connection with meteorological conditions. It is shaped and built out of meteorology. Another plant is much more closely bound up with the earth, is, so to speak, an expression of geology. If one really feels how the oil penetrates the olive tree, so that in one's own soul the elemental forces are stirred by the way in which the tree allows a new sprout to be grafted onto it and to flourish there, then one can feel how the olive tree is inwardly penetrated with the oil of earth. One can feel the earthly element pulsing through the oil. And now you will remember something I touched on in the second lecture, that Paul was called to build a bridge between Hebrew antiquity and Christianity, between geology and Christology. As we said, Paul's activity extends through the realm of the olive tree. And if we understand Apollo in the vapors rising from the mountain chasms, and how through the vapors he inspires the Pythia and speaks oracular words concerning human fate, then we can also feel how the elemental forces stream from the olive tree into its environment. And these are forces similar to the soul of Paul. We can feel it in his words. He immerses himself, as it were, in geology in order to feel the elemental forces in the aura of the olive tree and to let its aura inspire him in that geographical realm where his work lay. Nowadays, people read these things far too abstractly. They imagine that things said by writers in the past were as abstract, as dependent only on the brain, as are the things often said by modern authors. People do not reflect how not only understanding and reason, but all the forces of the soul can be connected in a primordial earthly sense with all that gives a certain region its particular stamp. It was the olive tree that gave its stamp to the Pauline region. And when Paul sought to raise the Jewish geology up to himself, then it was that, inspired by the olive tree, he spoke the most important things concerning the relationship of the Christ-filled man to men who are far from Christ. Let us hear the strange words Paul uses when he wishes to bring the Gentile Christians into relation with the Jews. They are not to be taken abstractly, but as words that rise new-minted from the elemental depths of his soul. Romans 11:13-24 from the New English Bible, quote, "But I have something to say to you Gentiles. I am a missionary to the Gentiles, and as such I give all honor to that ministry, when I try to stir emulation in the men of my own race, and so to save some of them. For if their rejection has meant the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean? Nothing less than life from the dead. If the first portion of dough is consecrated, so is the whole lump. If the root is consecrated, so are the branches. But if some of the branches have been lopped off, and you, a wild olive, have been grafted in among them, and have come to share the same root and sap as the olive, do not make yourself superior to the branches. If you do so, remember that it is not you who sustain the root sustains you. You will say, subquote, branches were lopped off so that I might be grafted in, close subquote. Very well, they were lopped off for lack of faith. And by faith you hold your place. Put away your pride, and be on your guard. For if God did not spare the native branches, no more will he spare you. Observe the kindness and the severity of God. Severity to those who fell away, divine kindness to you, if only you remain within its scope. Otherwise you too will be cut off, whereas they, if they do not continue faithless, will be grafted in. For it is in God's power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from your native wild olive, and against all nature grafted into the cultivated olive, how much more readily will they, the natural olive branches, be grafted into their native stock? Close quote. Thus wrote he of whom tomorrow we will speak further, showing how he took to what he had to say from Jewish geology and drew a superb picture of the elemental forces which rise up from the earth and reign in the olive tree. The end of Lecture 4. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. If you are listening to this as a podcast, it is at Rudolf Steiner Audio, located at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. This is a reading of a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Christ and the Spiritual World, The Search for the Holy Grail, translated by Charles Davy and D.S. Osmond. This is Lecture 5. I have spoken to you about the Sibyls, pointing out how they appear as shadows of the Greek philosophers in Ionia. Through centuries, they conjured up from their chaotic soul life a mixture of deep wisdom and sheer spiritual chaos. And they exerted much more influence on the spiritual life of Southern Europe and its neighboring regions than external history is willing to recognize. I wanted to indicate that this peculiar outpouring from the souls of the Sibyls points to a certain power of the human soul, which in ancient times, and even in the third post-Atlantean epoch, had some good significance. But as one culture epoch succeeds another in the course of human history, changes occur. The forces which the Sibyls employed to produce at times sheer nonsense were good, legitimate forces in the third post-Atlantean epoch, when astrology was studied and the wisdom of the stars worked into the souls of men, harmonizing the forces which later emerged chaotically as Sibyllism. You can gather from this that forces which prevail anywhere in the world, including those which prevailed in the souls of the Sibyls, should never be called good or bad in themselves. It depends on when and where they appear. The forces that appeared in the souls of the Sibyls were good and legitimate, but they were not adapted to the fourth post-Atlantean epoch. For the forces that were then intended to prevail in human souls were not those that come from subconscious depths, but those that speak to the soul through the clarity of the ego. Yesterday, we heard how the Hebrew prophets strove to suppress the Sibylline forces and to bring out the forces that speak through the clarity of the ego. This indeed was the essential characteristic of the old Hebrew school of prophecy, to press back the chaotic Sibylline forces and to bring out those which can speak through the ego. The fulfillment of this task given to the Hebrew prophets, we could call it a task of bringing the Sibylline forces into the right path of evolution, came about through the Christ impulse. When the Christ impulse entered into the evolution of humanity in the way known to us, one result was that the chaotic forces of the Sibyls were thrust back for a time, as when a stream disappears below ground and reappears later on. These forces were indeed to reappear in another form, a form purified by the Christ impulse. after the Christ impulse had entered into the aura of the earth. Just as in human life, after we have been using our soul forces throughout the day, we have to let them sink into nightly unconsciousness, so that they may reawake in the morning. So it was necessary that the Sibylline forces, legitimate as they had been during the third post-Atlantean epoch, should flow for a while below the surface, unnoticed, in order to reappear slowly, as we shall hear. The forces, legitimate human forces, which emerged so chaotically in the Sibyls, were cleansed, so to speak, by the Christ impulse, but then they sank below the surface of the soul. Human beings in their ordinary consciousness remained entirely unaware that the Christ continued to work on these forces, but so it was. From the standpoint of spiritual science, it is a superb drama to watch this impact of the Christ impulse, to see how from the Council of Nicaea onward human beings, in their normal consciousness, quarrel ardently about dogmas, while what was most important for Christianity takes its course in the subconscious depths of the soul. The Christ impulse does not work where there is strife, but below the surface, and human wisdom will have to uncover a great deal that we may think strange if we look at it superficially. Much will have to be revealed as a symptom of the Christ impulse working below the surface. Then we shall understand that essential developments in the historical configuration of Christianity in the West could not come about through the quarrels of bishops, but sprang from decisions which were reached below the surface of the soul and rose into consciousness like dreams, so that men were aware only of these dreamlike apprehensions and could not discern what was going on in the depths. I will mention only one symptom of this. There are events that reflect, as though through dreams, the activity which the Christ was undertaking in the depths of the soul in order to bring human soul forces into a right alignment with the course of Western history. Many of you will perhaps guess something of what I mean if we observe that on October 28, 312, when Constantine the Great, the son of Constantine Chlorus, was making war against Maxentius on the outskirts of Rome, a decision was taken which proved to be of the highest importance for the configuration of Christianity throughout the West. This battle in front of Rome was not determined by military orders, but by the unconscious acumen of the leaders, or by the unconscious acumen of the leaders, but by dreams and Sibylline omens. We are told, and this is the significant thing, that when Constantine was moving against the gates of Rome, Maxentius had a dream which said to him, quote, "Do not remain in the place where you are now." Close quote. Under the influence of this dream, reinforced by an appeal to the Sibylline books, Maxentius committed the greatest folly, looked at externally, that he could have committed. He left Rome and fought the battle with an army 4 times the size of Constantine's, not within the protection of the walls of Rome, but outside them. For the message received from the Sibylline books ran thus, quote, "If you fight against Constantine outside the gates of Rome, you will destroy Rome's greatest enemy." Close quote. A truly oracular utterance. Maxentius obeyed it, and with faith and courage went outside the gates. As on an earlier occasion, another Sibylline oracle had guided Croesus, so was Maxentius guided by this one. He destroyed the enemy of Rome, himself. Constantine had a different dream. It said to him, quote, "Carry in front of your troops the monogram of Christ." Close quote. He did so, and he won the battle. A decisive event for the configuration of Europe, brought about by dreams and Sibylline sayings. There we gain a glimpse of what was going on below the surface in the soul life of Europe. Truly, like a stream which has disappeared into mountain cavities, so that it is no longer to be seen up above, and one may form the strangest conjectures about it. So the Christ impulse works on below the surface, works at first as occult, that is, hidden reality. My dear friends, allow me at this point to confess to you that when, in my occult researches, I tried to follow this stream, I often lost trace of it. I had to search for places where it reappeared. I could suppose that the stream of the Christ impulse had reappeared slowly, and that even today it has not fully reappeared, but can only give evidence of itself. But where and how did it come to the surface? That is the question. Where did it lay hold of souls sufficiently to make an impression on their consciousness? If you follow up the various expositions in my books and lecture courses, and if you feel about it as I do, you will find, especially in the older ones, that what I have said in connection with the name of the Holy Grail is one of the least satisfying parts. That is how I feel, and I hope that others have felt it too. It is not that I have said anything that could not be upheld, but simply that when I spoke of this I felt unsatisfied. I had to give out what could be told with confidence, but often, when I tried to trace the further course of this stream, when I tried to unravel the further occult development of Christianity in the West, then before my soul rose the admonition, quote, "You must first read the name of Parsifal in its right place." Close quote. I had to experience the fact that occult researches are guided in a remarkable way, so that we may not be enticed into speculation or into realms where we can very easily be borne away from occult truth on the wings of fantasy. We have to be guided slowly and by stages, if at last our research is to bring to light the truth, which can of itself impart a kind of conviction of its rightness. So I often had to be content with waiting for an answer to the injunction, quote, "Search out where the name of Parsifal stands." Close quote. I had quite understood something you all know from the Parsifal saga. After Parsifal returns, in a certain sense cured of his errors, and again finds the way to the Holy Grail, he is told that his name will appear shining upon the holy vessel. But where is the holy vessel? Where is it to be found? That was the question. In occult researches of this kind, one is often held back, delayed, so that one may not do too much in a day or a year, and be driven on to speculate about the truth. Landmarks appear. For me they appeared in the course of really a good many years, during which I sought an answer to the question, where will you find the name of Parsifal written on the Holy Grail? I knew that many meanings can be attached to the holy vessel in which the host, the holy bread or wafer, is placed. And on the holy vessel itself, Parsifal was to shine. I was aware also of the deep significance of a passage such as that in St. Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, 33 and 34, where we are told that the Lord often spoke in parables and only gradually clarified their meaning. In occult investigation, too, one is led gradually, step by step, and very often only in connection with karmic guidance, and on encountering something that seems to have to do with a certain matter, one very often does not know what will be made of it in one's own soul under the influence of forces coming from the spiritual world. Often one does not know in the least whether something drawn from the depths of the occult world will have a bearing on some problem that one has been following up for years. Thus I did not know how to proceed when I once asked the Norwegian folk spirit, the northern folk spirit, about Parsifal, and he said, quote, "Learn to understand the saying that through my powers there flowed into the northern Parsifal saga, quote, subquote, Ganganda Graida, subquote, close quote, continue quote, circulating cordial, close quote, or something like that." Footnote, another possible rendering is journeying viaticum. End of footnote. I had no idea what to make of this. It was the same when I was coming out of St. Peter's in Rome under the strong impression made on me by Michelangelo's work that you find on the right-hand side as you enter, the mother with Jesus, the mother who looks so young, with Jesus dead already on her knees. And under the after effect of looking at this work of art, this was a leading of the kind I mean, there came to me, not as a vision, but as a true imagination from the spiritual world, a picture which is inscribed in the Akashic record, showing how Parsifal, after he has gone away for the first time from the castle of the Grail, where he had failed to ask about the mysteries which prevail there, meets in the forest a young woman who is holding her bridegroom in her lap and weeping over him. But I knew that whether it is the mother or the bride whose bridegroom is dead, Christ is often called the bridegroom, the picture had a meaning, and that the connection thus established, without my having done anything about it, had a meaning also. I could tell you of many indications of this kind that came to me during my search for an answer to the question, where can I find the name of Parsifal inscribed on the Holy Grail? For it had to be there, as the saga itself tells us. And now we need to recall the most important features of the saga. We know that Parsifal's mother, Herzeleide, bore him in great suffering, and with dreamlike visions of a quite peculiar character. We know that she wished to shield him from knightly exercises and the code of knightly virtue, that she arranged for the management of her property and withdrew into solitude. She wanted to bring up her child so that he would remain a stranger to the impulses that were certainly present in him, for he was not to be exposed to the dangers that had surrounded his father. But we know also that from an early age the child began to notice everything glorious in nature. From his mother's teaching, he really learned nothing except that there was a ruling God, and he conceived a wish to serve this God. But he knew nothing of what this God was. And when, one day, he met some knights, he took them for God and knelt before them. When he confessed to his mother that he had seen the knights and wanted to be a knight himself, she put on him a fool's garments and sent him forth. He met with many adventures, and later on people may call this sentimental, but it is of the deepest significance. The mother died of a broken heart because of her son's disappearance. He had not turned back to give her any farewell greeting, but had gone forth to experience knightly adventures. We know that after many wanderings, during which he learned much about knightly ways and knightly honor, and distinguished himself, he came to the castle of the Grail. On other occasions I have mentioned that the best literary account of Parsifal's arrival at the castle is to be found in Chrétien de Troyes. There we are shown how, after often mistaking the way, Parsifal comes to a lonely place and finds two men. One is steering a little boat, and the other is fishing from it. They direct him to the Fisher King, and presently he encounters the Fisher King in the Grail castle. The Fisher King is old and feeble, and has to rest on a couch. While conversing with Parsifal, the Fisher King hands him a sword, a gift from his niece. Then there appears first in the room a page carrying a spear. The spear is bleeding, and the blood runs down over the page's hand. And then a maiden with the Holy Grail, which is a kind of dish. But such glory streams forth from it that all the lights in the hall are outshone by the light of the Holy Grail, just as the stars are overpowered by the light of sun and moon. And then we learn how in the Holy Grail there is something with which the Fisher King's aged father is nourished in a separate room. He has no need of the sumptuously appointed meal of which the Fisher King and Parsifal partake. These two nourish themselves with earthly food, but each time a new course, as we should say nowadays, is served, the Holy Grail withdraws into the room of the Fisher King's aged father, whose only nourishment comes from that which is within the Holy Grail. Parsifal, to whom it had been intimated on his way from Gurnemanz that he ought not to ask too many questions, does not inquire why the lance bleeds or what the vessel of the Grail signifies. Naturally, he did not know their names. He then goes to bed for the night, in the same room, according to Chrétien de Troyes, where all this has happened. He was intending to ask questions in the morning, but when morning came he found the whole castle empty. Nobody was there. He called out for someone. Nobody was there. He got dressed, and downstairs he found his horse ready. He thought the whole company had ridden out to hunt, and wanted to ride after them in order to ask about the miracle of the Grail. But when he was crossing the drawbridge, it rose up so quickly that his horse had to make a leap in order not to be thrown into the castle moat. And he found no trace of the company he had encountered in the castle on the previous day. Then Chrétien de Troyes tells us how Parsifal rides on, and in a lonely part of the wood comes upon a woman with her husband on her knees and weeping for him. It is she, according to Chrétien de Troyes, who first indicates to him how he should have asked questions, so as to experience the effect of his questions on the great mysteries that had been shown to him. We then hear that he went on, often wandering from the right road, until exactly on a Good Friday he came to a hermit named Treverisant. The hermit tells him how he is being cursed because he has wasted the opportunity of bringing about something like a redemption for the Fisher King by asking questions about the miracles in the castle. And then he is given many and various teachings. Now, when I tried to accompany Parsifal to the hermit, a saying was disclosed to me, a saying which, in the words I have to use for it, in accordance with spiritual scientific investigation, is nowhere recorded, but I am able to give you the full truth of it. It was spoken, and it made a deep impression on me, by the old hermit to Parsifal, after he had made him acquainted, as far as he could, with the mystery of Golgotha, of which Parsifal knew little, although he had arrived there on a Good Friday. The old hermit then uttered this saying, I shall use words that are current among us today, and are perfectly faithful to the sense of the utterance, quote, "Think of what happened on the occasion of the mystery of Golgotha. Raise your eyes to the Christ hanging on the cross, at the moment when he said, "From this hour on, there is your mother," and John left her not. But you, said the old hermit to Parsifal, you have left your mother Herzeleida. It was on your account that she passed from this world. The complete connection was not understood by Parsifal, but the words were spoken with the spiritual intention that they should work in his soul as a picture, so that from this picture of John, who did not forsake his mother, he might discern the karmic debt he had incurred by his having deserted his own mother. This was to produce an after effect in his soul. We hear then that Parsifal stayed a short while longer with the hermit, and then set out again to find the Holy Grail. And it so happens that he finds the Grail shortly, or directly before the death of the old Amfortas, the Fisher King. Then it is that the Knights of the Holy Grail, the Knights of that holy order, come to him with the words, quote, "Thy name shines in the Grail. Thou art the future ruler, the King of the Grail, for thy name shines out from the holy vessel." Parsifal becomes the Grail King. And so the name Parsifal stands on the holy gold-gleaming vessel in which is the host. It stands there. And now, as my concern was to find the vessel, I was at first misled by a certain circumstance. In occult research, I say this in all humility, with no wish to make an arrogant claim, it has always seemed to me necessary, when a serious problem is involved, to take account not only of what is given directly from occult sources, but also of what external research has brought to light. And in following up a problem, it seems to me specially good to make a really conscientious study of what external scholarship has to say, so that one keeps one's feet on the earth and does not get lost in cloud cuckoo land. But in the present instance, it was exoteric scholarship, this was some time ago, that led me astray. For I gathered from it that when Wolfram von Eschenbach began to write his Parsifal poem, he had, according to his own statement, made use of Chrétien de Troyes and of a certain Caillot. external research had never been able to trace this Kayat, and regards him as having been invented by Wolfram von Eschenbach, as though Wolfram von Eschenbach had wanted to attribute to a further source his own extensive additions to Chrétien de Troyes. Exoteric learning is prepared to admit at most that Kayat was a copyist of the works of Chrétien de Troyes, and that Wolfram von Eschenbach had put the whole thing together in a rather fanciful way. So you see in what direction external research goes. It is bound to draw one away, more or less, from the path that leads to Kayat. At the same time, when I had been to a certain extent led astray by external research, something else was borne in upon me. Parenthesis, this was another of the karmic leadings. Close parenthesis. I have often spoken of it in my book Occult Science and in lecture courses, and should now like to put it as follows. The first 3 post-Atlantean epochs, which occur before the mystery of Golgotha, reappear in a certain sense after the 4th epoch, so that the 3rd epoch reappears in our epoch, the 5th, the 2nd epoch will recur in the 6th, and the 1st epoch, the epoch of the Holy Rishis, will recur in the 7th, as I have often described. It became clearer and clearer to me, as the outcome of many years of research, that in our epoch there is really something like a resurrection of the astrology of the 3rd epoch, but permeated now with the Christ impulse. Today we must search among the stars in a way different from the old ways, but the stellar script must once more become something that speaks to us. And now observe, these thoughts about a revival of the stellar script linked themselves in a remarkable way to the secret of Parsifal, so that I could no longer avoid the belief that the two were connected with each other. And then a picture rose before my soul, a picture shown to me while I was trying to accompany Parsifal in the spirit on his way back to the Grail castle after his meeting with the hermit Treverescent. This meeting with the hermit is recounted by Chrétien de Troyes in a particularly beautiful and touching way. I should like to read you a little of this, telling how Parsifal comes to the hermit. Readers aside, there's now a piece in German, and I'm going to pass the piece in German and read the translation. End of readers aside. He roused the steed to start, and sighed from out his deepest heart, for guilt to God doth rack his breast. Remorseful feelings give no rest. With weeping comes he through the wood, yet halts where hermitage has stood. Makes ready to dismount, lays weapons on the ground, and finds within a chapel cell the pious man. For him he fell upon his knees in woeful plight. The tear that blinked before his sight now rolls at last down to his chin, as he with simple childlike mien doth fold his hands together, that he may solace gather. Hear ye my sad confession? 5 years I bore delusion, while without faith my life I led, and only strove toward the bad. Say me wherefore thou hast done, and pray to God that he ere long will draw thee near the holy bond. I once by Fisher King did stand. I saw the spear upon whose steel hung drops of blood. I saw the Grail, yet did forbear to put the word. What signified this blood, this Grail, what signified? 'Twere better had I died. Until this day indeed my soul's in direst need. Our Lord I thought of nevermore, and from his grace I stayed afar. Now tell me what thy name may be, as Parsifal men speak of me. Then sighs the aged man with groan, the name to him is full well known. What thou unwittingly hast left undone has brought this sorrow as thy doom. Close quote, translation, footnote, translation by M. Cotterill, end of footnote. Continue Steiner. Then come the conversations between Parsifal and the hermit, of which I have spoken already. And when I sought to accompany Parsifal in spirit during his return to the Grail, it was often as though there shone forth in the soul how he travelled by day and by night, how he devoted himself to nature by day and to the stars by night, as if the stellar script had spoken to his unconscious self, and as if this was a prophecy of that which the holy company of knights who came from the Grail to meet him had said, quote, "Thy name shines forth in radiance from the Grail." Close quote. But Parsifal, quite clearly, did not know what to make of the message of the stars, for it remained in his unconscious being, and therefore one cannot so very well interpret it, however much one may try to immerse oneself in it through spiritual research. Then I tried once more to get back to Kayat, and behold, a particular thing said about him by Wolfram von Eschenbach made a deep impression on me, and I felt I had to relate it to the, quote, Ganganda Graida, close quote. The connection seemed inevitable. I had to relate it also to the image of the woman holding her dead bridegroom on her lap. And then, when I was not in the least looking for it, I came upon a saying of Kayat. And this is the German, Jak es hieß ein Ding der Grail, close quote. And this means, quote, he said a thing was called the Grail, close quote. Now, exoteric research itself tells us how Kayat came to these words. He acquired a book by Phlegetonis in Spain, an astrological book. No doubt about it, one may say. Kayat is the man who, stimulated by Phlegetonis, whom he calls Phlegetonis, and in whom lives a certain knowledge of the stellar script, Kayat is the man who, stimulated by this revived astrology, sees the thing called the Grail. Then I knew that Kayat is not to be given up. I knew that he discloses an important clue. If one is searching in the sense of spiritual science, he at least has seen the Grail. Where then is the Grail, which today must be found in such a way that the name of Parsifal stands upon it? Where can it be found? Now, in the course of my researches, it had been shown to me that the name, that is the first thing, must be sought for in the stellar script. And then, on a day which I must regard as specially significant for me, I was shown where the gold-gleaming vessel in its reality is to be found, so that through its symbolical expression in the stellar script, we are led to the secret of the Grail. And then I saw in the stellar script something that anyone can see, only he will not immediately discern the secret. For one day, while I was following with inner sight the gold-gleaming sickle of the moon, as it appeared in the heavens, with the dark moon like a great disk dimly visible within it, so that with physical sight one saw the gold-gleaming moon, Ganganda Graida, the journeying viaticum, and within it the large host, the dark disk. This is not to be seen if one merely glances superficially at the moon, but it is evident if one looks closely, and there in wonderful letters of the occult script was the name Parsifal. That, to begin with, was the stellar script, or in fact, if this reading of the stellar script is seen in the right light, it yields for our hearts and minds something, though perhaps not all, of the Parsifal secret, the secret of the Holy Grail. What I have still to say briefly on this subject I will give you tomorrow. The end of Lecture 5. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com, or if you are listening to the podcast, that is at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. This is a reading of a cycle of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled Christ and the Spiritual World, The Search for the Holy Grail, and it is translated by Charles Davy and D.S. Osmond. This is the last lecture, Lecture 6. In the preceding lecture, I tried to present what I had to tell you about the mystery of the Grail and its connections in such a way as to let you see how these things reveal themselves gradually to the seeker's soul. I have not withheld the various difficulties that must be gone through before that which may be called the result of research is given to the soul from out of the spiritual world. Of course, I know very well that if modern psychology, which remains so superficial, gets hold of such descriptions, it will bring forward all possible, or rather the most impossible, objections. And I am well aware of all the doubts that can be raised, the curious assertions about all sorts of laws and associations of ideas and subconscious images. In spite of all this, and precisely in full consciousness of it, I have for once given you this unvarnished account, because for you as anthroposophists it should be important to be clear that the results to which one has to come in spiritual research are to be reached only after overcoming all the things which, as I told you yesterday, stand in the way. And the final result of spiritual research is not the outcome of ideas that have been put together, as might be supposed. For these ideas are like messengers, leading to the final result, and have nothing to do with the result itself. I wanted to make these preliminary remarks because the latest publications show what happens again and again when these expositions are printed as lecture courses. They are given to people outside our movement, who then make the most senseless remarks about them, and of course take pleasure in quoting from them out of context and so on. And let me also say, without the least wish to appear presumptuous, that because of our movement, a time has come when someone or other may think it profitable to attack us, and we can be sure that for such a purpose any means would serve. I have said that the stellar script is to be found in the heavens, but it is not in any sense the Grail, and it does not yield us the Grail. I have expressly emphasized, and I beg you to take this emphasis very seriously, that the name of the Grail is to be found through the stellar script, not the Grail itself. I have pointed to the fact that in the gold gleaming sickle of the moon, as any close observer can see, the dark part of the moon emerges, and is as though marked off from the bright sickle. And there, in occult writing, is to be found the name of Parsifal. Now, before we go further and try to interpret this sign in the heavens, I must draw your attention to an important law, an important fact. The gold gleaming sickle becomes apparent because the physical rays of the sun fall on the moon. The illuminated part of the moon shines out as the gold gleaming vessel. Within it rests the dark host. Physically, this is the dark part not reached by the sun's rays. Spiritually, there is something else. When the rays of the sun fall on part of the moon and are reflected in gleaming light, something does, nevertheless, pass through the physical matter. This something is the spiritual element that lives in the sun's rays. The spiritual power of the sun is not held back and reflected, as the sun's physical power is. It goes through. And because it is resisted by the power of the moon, what we see at rest in the golden vessel is actually the spiritual power of the sun. So we can say, in the dark part of the moon we are looking at the spiritual power of the sun. In the gold gleaming part, the vessel, we see reflected the physical power of the sun. The spirit of the sun rests in the vessel of the sun's physical power. So in truth the spirit of the sun rests in the vessel of the moon. And if we now recollect all that we have ever said about this sun spirit in relation to the Christ, then in what the moon does physically, an important symbol will be manifest. Because the moon reflects the sun's rays, and in this way brings into being the gold gleaming vessel, it appears to us as the bearer of the sun spirit. For the sun spirit appears within the moon's vessel in the form of the wafer-like disk. And let us remember that in the Parsifal saga it is emphasized that on every Good Friday, and thus during the Easter festival, the host descends from heaven into the Grail and is renewed. It sinks into the Grail like a rejuvenating nourishment. At the Easter festival, when Parsifal is again directed toward the Grail by the hermit. At the Easter festival, whose significance for the Grail has also been brought nearer to mankind again through Wagner's title Parsifal. Now, let us recall how, in accordance with an old tradition, one of those traditions of which I spoke yesterday, as having arisen from the working of the Christ impulse in the depths of the soul, the date of the Easter festival was established. Which is the day appointed for the Easter festival? The day when the vernal sun, which means the sun that is gathering strength, our symbol for the Christ, reaches the first Sunday after the full moon. How does the vernal full moon stand in the heavens at the Easter festival? How must it stand? It must begin at least a little to become a sickle. Something must be visible of the dark part, something of the sun spirit, who has gained his vernal strength, must be within it. This means that according to an ancient tradition, the picture of the Holy Grail must appear in the heavens at the Easter festival. It must be so. At the Easter festival, therefore, everyone can see this picture of the Holy Grail. According to a very ancient tradition, the date of the Easter festival is regulated with this in view. Now let us try again to get our bearings with regard to developments that have taken their course below the surface of soul life. Yesterday we said that the force which emerged in the Sibyls had to be moderated. It had to be permeated by the Christ impulse. And in this moderated form it had to reappear, so that it might become the bearer of spiritual culture in later times. Now let us ask, was Parsifal, as Chrétien de Troyes called him, able to perceive in himself something of the Christ impulse at work in the depths of his soul? If we look back once more at the primal character of the ancient Hebrew geology, one thing strikes us again and again. We shall grasp the spirit of this ancient Hebrew geology only if we realize that the whole of Hebrew antiquity tried with all its might to hold fast to the geological character of its revelations. I have shown how these revelations must be looked for, and can everywhere be traced in the activities and spiritual mobility of the earth. The Hebrew endeavor was to keep at bay the elemental activities that derive from the stars and served to stimulate spiritually the power of the Sibyls. The influence of the stars was justified in the astrology of the third post-Atlantean epoch, for humanity then retained so much of the old ancestral spirituality that when men devoted their souls to the elements, they absorbed a good influence from the stars. During the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, the power of the stars receded in face of the elements which surround the earth in the atmosphere and everywhere else. The influx of the elements was felt in such a way that anyone who understood the spirit of the age, especially as the fourth epoch advanced further and further, was constrained to say to himself, quote, "Let us guard ourselves against the influence that plays into the elements from the stars. It produces something like the unlawful Sibylline forces." Close quote. Through the Christ impulse, having poured itself out into the earth's aura, the Sibylline forces were to be harmonized and rendered capable of again yielding lawful revelations. Never willingly did the true initiate of Hebrew antiquity look to the stars when he wished for a revelation of the Spirit. He had vowed himself to the Yahweh God, who belongs to the evolution of the earth, and, as I have shown in occult science, had become a moon god only in order to help the earth forward. In the moon festivals of the Jews, it was made clear that the, quote, Lord of the earth, close quote, shines down symbolically in his reflection from the moon. Quote, "But go no further," close quote. That was the warning given by old Hebrew tradition to the pupil, quote, "Go no further. Be content with what Yahweh reveals in his moon symbol. Go no further. The time has not yet come for drawing out of the elements anything more than is expressed in the moon symbol. Anything more would belong to the unlawful Sibylline forces." Close quote. When all that has come over into Earth evolution from the Saturn, Sun, and Moon periods is grasped in its natural aspect, then we find it symbolized in the old Hebrew tradition through Eve. Eve, the vowels are never clearly pronounced. Eve, maybe Eva. Add to it the sign for the divine being of Hebrew antiquity, who is the ruler of earth history, and we have a form that is quite as valid as any other. Yahweh, Yahweh, the ruler of the earth who has his symbol in the moon. If we bring this into conjunction with what has come over from the moon period, with its outcome for earth evolution, we have the ruler of the earth united with the earth mother, whose powers are a result of the moon period, Yahweh. Readers aside, forgive me, but I think Steiner is connecting Eva with Yahweh, but I'm not positive. End of readers aside. Hence, out of Hebrew antiquity, there emerges this mysterious connection of the moon forces, which have left their remains in the moon, known to astronomy, and their human forces in the female element in human life. The connection of the ruler of the earth with the moon mother is given to us in the name Yahweh. Now, I should like to bring before you two facts which will perhaps indicate how, under the influence of the Christ impulse, the Sibylline forces have been transformed in the subconscious depths of soul life. I want to touch on a manifestation to which I called attention 3 years ago, 3 years almost to the day. The transformation of a Sibyl under the influence of the Christ impulse. In the lectures printed under the title of Occult History, Personalities and Events in the Light of Spiritual Science, footnote, see lectures 2 and 3 of this course, end of footnote, I referred to the appearance of the Maid of Orleans. I pointed out how events of the greatest importance for the destiny of Europe in the subsequent era flowed from what the Maid of Orleans accomplished under the influence of her inspirations, fully permeated by the Christ impulse, beginning in the autumn of 1428. From external history, one can indeed learn that the destiny of Europe would have been very different if the Maid of Orleans had not appeared when she did, and only an entirely obsessed materialist such as Anatole France can deny that something mysterious came into history at that time. I will not repeat here what can be read in history books. Anyone who has listened to these lectures can see that something like a modern Sibyl emerged in the Maid of Orleans. It was the time, the 15th century, when the fifth post-Atlantean epoch begins, a time when the Christ impulse had to emerge more and more from the subconscious depths of the soul. We can see in what a gentle, tender form, imbued with the noblest qualities of the human soul, the Sibylline power of the Maid of Orleans is revealed. I would like to take this opportunity of reading to you a letter written by a man who lived through these events, for it shows what an impression the Sibylline power of the Maid of Orleans made on those who had a heart and feeling for it. He was a man in the entourage of the king, whom the Maid of Orleans liberated. After describing her achievements, he writes, quote, "This and much more has the Maid brought about, and with God's help she will accomplish still greater things. The girl is of appealing beauty and manly bearing. She speaks little and shows remarkable sagacity. When she speaks, she has a pleasing, delicately feminine voice. She eats little and abstains from wine. She takes pleasure in fine horses and weapons and admires well-accoutred and noble men. To be obliged to meet and converse with large numbers of people is abhorrent to her. Her tears often overflow. She loves a happy face, endures unheard-of toil, and is so assiduous in the manipulation and bearing of weapons that she remains uninterruptedly for 6 days, day and night, in full armor. She says that the English have no right to France, and therefore, as she says, God has sent her to drive them out and conquer them, but only after previous warning. For the king she shows the deepest veneration. She says he is beloved by God, is under special protection, and will therefore be preserved. Of the Duke of Orleans, your nephew, she says that he will be delivered in a miraculous way. but only after a demand for his release has been made to the English who hold him prisoner. With that revered Duke, I bring my report to a conclusion. Still more wonderful things are happening and have happened than I can describe, than I can write of or describe to you in words. While I write this, the aforesaid maid has already gone to the neighborhood of the city of Rheims in Champagne, whither the king has hastily set off for his anointing and crowning under God's protection. Most respected and powerful Duke and greatly honored master, I commend myself to you in all humility, while praying the Almighty to protect you and fulfill your desires. Written at Bitteromus, the 21st day of June in the year 1429, your humble servant, Percival, Lord of Bonlamioc, Councillor and Chamberlain of the King of the French, and of the Duke of Orleans, Seneschal of Berry. Close quote. So wrote a Percival to the Duke of Milan about the maid. Anyone reading it will feel how we have here a description of a Christ-filled Sibyl. That is one thing. The other to which I wish to call your attention is also a fact from the new times that the fifth post-Atlantean epoch brought in. It is something written by a man who, one might say, was justified in feeling himself permeated with the spirit of this new epoch. So much so that what he experienced unconsciously might be expressed as follows. Quote, "Yes, a time is coming when the old astrology will live again in a new form, a Christ-filled form. And then, if one can practice it properly, so that it will be permeated with the Christ impulse, one may venture to look up to the stars and question them about their spiritual script." Close quote. Here was a man, as you will shortly see, who felt deeply that the earth is not as modern materialistic geology portrays it, purely physical and mineral, but a living being, endowed not merely with a body, as the modern materialist wants us to believe, but also with a soul. He knew this in such a way that he could feel something like the following, although he could not have expressed it in these words, since the spiritual science of today was not then available. Quote, "The Christ impulse has been received by the earth soul into its aura, and so a man whose soul feels imbued with the earth's aura and with the Christ impulse may again look up to what is written in the stars." Close quote. And in fact this was done. Men did look up to the stars. Although this approach brought with it a great deal of superstition, especially among the old astronomers who appeared at that time, yet we find a certain man, deeply bound up with the spiritual life of the new epoch, writing in this way, quote, "These and countless other changes and phenomena which take place on the earth are so exact and regular that they cannot be ascribed to a blind cause. And since the planets themselves know nothing of the angles which their rays make with the earth must have a soul. The earth is an animal." Close quote. Bracket Steiner again. He does not mean an animal in the ordinary sense, but a living organism. Close bracket. Quote, "One can observe in the earth a complete analogy with the parts of an animal body. Plants are its hair, metals are its veins, the waters of the sea are its drink. The earth has a formative power, a kind of imagination. It has movement, certain illnesses, and ebb and flow are its respirations. The soul of the earth seems to be a kind of flame, hence the subterranean warmth and the fact that without warmth there is no propagation. A certain image of the zodiac and of the whole firmament is imprinted by God in the soul of the earth. This is the bond between the heavens and the earth, the cause of sympathy between heaven and earth. The archetypes of all these movements and functions are implanted by God the Creator in the earth. The soul is in the center of the earth. It sends out forms or impressions of itself in all directions, and in this way experiences all harmonious changes and objects outside itself. As it is with the soul of the earth, so is it with the soul of man. All mathematical ideas and proofs, for example, are created by the soul from out of itself, or they would not have such a high degree of certainty and precision. The planets and their aspects have influence on the soul powers of men. They stir up emotions and passions of all kinds, leading often to the most terrible actions and events. They have influence on conception and therefore on human temperament and character. A great part of astrology has to do with this. Probably the sun does not only radiate light and warmth throughout the cosmos, it may also be the seat and center of pure reason and the source of universal harmony. And all the planets are ensouled. In the whole creation there is a magnificent and wonderful harmony, in the realm of the senses as well as in the supersensible, in ideas as well as in things, in the kingdoms of nature and in the gifts of grace. This harmony is found both in things themselves and in the relations between them. The highest harmony is God, and He has impressed on all souls an inner harmony as His signature. Numbers, shapes, the stars, and nature in general harmonize with certain mysteries of the Christian religion. Thus, for example, in the cosmos there are three things at rest: the sun, the fixed stars, and the intermedium, and all else is in movement. And so in the one God are Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The sphere represents the Trinity. The Father is the center, the Son the surface, and the Holy Spirit the uniformity of the distance from center to surface, the radius. And so it is with other mysteries. Without spirits and souls there would not be harmony everywhere. In human souls we find harmonious predispositions of an endlessly varied kind. The whole earth is ensouled. And thus the great harmony is brought about, not only on earth, but between the earth and the constellations. This soul works throughout the body of the earth, but it has its seat in a particular place, just as the human soul has its seat in the heart. And from this place, as though from a focus or source, its workings go out into the ocean and the atmosphere. Hence the sympathy between the earth and the stars. Hence the regularity of nature's processes. The fact that the earth truly has a soul is shown most clearly by observing weather conditions and the aspects under which they habitually occur. Under certain aspects and constellations, the air is always restless. If such aspects are not present, or are few or transient, the air remains quiet. Close quote. Thus wrote a man in 1607, a man in whom lived and pulsed, as the New Age came in, the Christ-filled astrology, which draws after it, merely as its shadow, astrological superstition. Thus wrote a man out of the most devout mood of soul, a man who knew that people had formerly made use, at first rightly and afterward wrongly, of the forces that spring from the elemental world, the Sibylline forces, we should now call them. For it cannot be denied, he wrote, that such spirits, he means spirits which maintain communication between the stars and the earth, establish themselves in the elements which surround the earth as its atmosphere. He continues, quote, "It cannot be denied that such spirits formerly imparted their oracular sayings to men through idols and oak trees, out of groves and grottos, through animals and so on. And soothsaying from the flight of birds was not merely an art of deceiving the weak. Those spirits were active in guiding the birds through the air, and by this means, with God's permission, much was intimated to men in former times. Even today we hear stories of fateful birds, such as owls, vultures, eagles, ravens. But the more such stories are despised, the rarer they become. For these spirits cannot bear being despised, as according to the law of God and Christian teaching, they certainly deserve to be. They prefer to fly away and keep silent. From the beginning, the lying tempter was allowed to speak through animals. He spoke to Eve through the serpent, and thus he led the human race astray. That was always the way of these spirits from then onward. Whenever they could speak to men through the bodies and movements of animals, through voices or portents, they misused this power, appropriating for themselves the reverence due to God and misleading unhappy men. And now, although Christ came to destroy the work of the devil and imposed silence on these spirits, and although they lost their temple statues, their groves and their caves and the earth they had so long possessed, yet they are always here still in the empty air, and with God's permission they utter their scattered cries. Often they are God's scourges. Often he allows certain things to be announced through them to men. Close quote. The author of these words gives a gentle indication of how the spiritual revelations come to be permeated by Christ. For he writes in a frame of mind that can truly be called Christ-filled. In 1607, he spoke thus of the changes that had come about in the spiritual world. Who is this man? Is he someone who has no right to speak? Someone we can leave unheard? No, for without him we should have no modern astronomy or physics. He is Johannes Kepler. And one would like to advise those who call themselves materialists or monists and look to Kepler as their idol, one would like to advise them to consider carefully, just for once, this passage in Kepler's writings. The greatest astronomical laws, the 3 Kepler laws, which dominate present-day astronomy, are his. Yet you have heard how he speaks of the new influence which gradually enters into Earth evolution with the 5th post-Atlantean epoch. We must all again get accustomed by degrees, having thoroughly absorbed the new influence, to recognize something of the spiritual activities connected with the stars. What sort of time was it then, when Parsifal entered the Grail castle, still ignorant, not ready to ask questions, according to the later tradition taken up by Wolfram von Eschenbach? What sort of time was it when Parsifal entered the castle, where Amfortas lay wounded and on Parsifal's arrival suffered unceasing pain from his wound? What was this time? The saga itself tells us it was a Saturn time. Footnote, that is a period when the forces of Saturn work with particular strength. End of footnote. Saturn and the Sun stood together in Cancer, approaching culmination. So we see how, in the most intimate effects, a connection between the earth and the stars is established. It was a Saturn time. And if we now ask how Parsifal gradually gains knowledge, what do we find? Who is he, this Parsifal? He is ignorant of certain things. He is held to be ignorant. But of what? Now we have heard that the Christ impulse flows on as though through subterranean channels in the depths of the soul. Up above, the theological controversies go on, and from them traditional Christianity takes shape. Let us follow the personality of Parsifal as the saga portrays him. He knows nothing about the surface course of events. He is kept in ignorance precisely of all that. He is protected from it. What he learns to know comes from sources active in the depths of the soul, as we heard yesterday. At first, riding away in ignorance from the Grail castle, he learns it from the woman who mourns the dead bridegroom in her lap, then from the hermit who is brought into connection with mystic powers, and from the power of the Grail, for it is on a Good Friday that he comes to the hermit. Already the power of the Grail is working in him unconsciously. Thus he is one of those who know nothing of what has been going on externally, one of those who are led into relation with the influences flowing from unconscious sources to meet the new age. He is a man whose heart and soul were to receive in innocence, undisturbed by the effects of the external world on human life, the secret of the Grail. He is to receive the secret with the highest, purest, noblest forces of the soul. He has to meet someone who has not developed the soul forces which could completely experience the Grail. He has to meet Amfortas. We know that Amfortas had indeed been marked out as the guardian of the Grail, but he succumbed to the lower forces in human nature. And how he had succumbed is connected with the guardianship of the Grail. He had killed his adversary out of lust and jealousy. These things are obvious, but as they are repeatedly misunderstood, it must be said that anthroposophy does not teach asceticism. Something much deeper lies behind. As late as the third post-Atlantean epoch, there were natural elemental forces which were taken into consideration, not so much for the way in which they were expressed in daily life, as for the connection they revealed with the spiritual world. The elemental forces that pulsed in the human blood and nervous system were raised into a relationship with the mysteries. It was not a question of subjecting the senses to ascetic discipline, but of becoming aware of the holy mysteries. In the third post-Atlantean epoch, one could still come to the mysteries with the same forces which otherwise dominate men on earth. But the time was at hand when the holy mysteries were to be revealed only to the pure and blameless forces of the soul, when men would find the possibility of rising above the bonds which tie them to an earthly calling. Anthroposophy does not seek to estrange anyone from the earth, but it was then a question of raising oneself above those earthly ties and from the influence of the old astrology. A man had to raise himself if he was to find the old mysteries in the new way, with the powers of the innocent soul which had freed itself from everything earthly. Over against the contrast set up by Hebrew antiquity, another contrast had to be created. Hebrew antiquity had rigorously insisted, quote, nothing of the Sibylline forces, which were justified at one time in astrology, nothing of them. Let us cleave to our earth god, Yahweh, close quote. From this came a denial of all revelations from above and an acceptance of revelations from below, a fear of all that reveals itself from the heavens. This outlook had to prevail on earth for a season, and a certain opposition to anything that came from above had to establish itself. And in such forces as those of the Sibyls, people saw the unlawful Luciferic forces coming from above. But presently, after the Christ had descended into the body of Jesus of Nazareth, that which came from above was imbued with the Christ impulse. Men could venture again to look up to the heavens. And something else had come about through the union of the ruler of earth with the moon mother. For the Christ, who had poured himself out into the earth's aura, had become the Lord of the earth. Worldly concerns, such as were pursued at the court of King Arthur, could be approached with earthly forces, but it was not permitted to approach the concerns of the Holy Grail in this way, as Amfortas had found. Footnote, see title Cosmic Christianity and the Impulse of Michael, lectures 3 and 6, given by Dr. Steiner and Torquay in London, August 1924, end of footnote. Anyone who attempted it was bound to suffer pain, and since the working of the stars had been permeated by the Christ, a man had to be found who had remained untouched by the controversies in the external world, and through his karma stood at a point where his soul could be approached by Christ. A man, too, who was related to the forces indicated by the symbol of the Saturn time, with Saturn and the Sun standing together in the sign of Cancer. So it was that Parsifal, in whom the Christ impulse was still working unconsciously in the depths of his soul, comes with the power of Saturn, and the wound burns as it had never burnt before. Thus we see how the New Age declares itself, how the soul of Parsifal is related to the new subconscious historical impulse permeated by the Christ aura, the Christ impulse, although he knows nothing of it. But the forces which had guided human history from below the surface were gradually to emerge, and Parsifal, accordingly, had to come by degrees to understand something that will never be understood unless it is approached with the pure and blameless forces of the soul, and not with traditional knowledge and scholarship. Then we can see, for this has by now come to the surface, and is almost as familiar as the name of the Holy Grail itself, how it represents the renewing, in a different form, of what ancient Hebraism had fought in its day. Let us set before us the Virgin Mother with the Christ upon her knees, and let us then express it thus. He who can feel the holiness of this picture will feel the same for the Holy Grail. Above all other lights, all other gods, shines the holy vessel, the Moon Mother now touched by Christ, the new Eve, the bearer of the Sun Spirit, Christ. Think of the, in quotes, what, but still more of the, in quotes, how. And let us look into the soul of Parsifal. How, riding out from the Grail castle, he encounters the sight of the bride and bridegroom, which brings him into connection with subconscious Christ forces. Let us look how the hermit at Eastertide, when the picture of the Grail is written in the heavens, in the stellar script, gives instruction to Parsifal's pure soul. Let us follow him as he rides on, as I emphasized yesterday, by day and night, looking at nature by day and with the symbol of the Holy Grail often before him at night. How he rides on, having before him the gold gleaming sickle of the moon with the host, the Christ Spirit, the Sun Spirit within it. Let us see how on his way he is made ready to understand the secret of the Holy Grail by the concordance between the picture of the Virgin Mother with her bridegroom Son and the sign of the heavenly script. Let us see how the permeation of the earth's destiny with the Christ impulse works together in his soul with the stellar script which has to be made new. Let us see how all that is permeated with Christ is related to the forces of the stars. Since Parsifal had to enter the Grail castle at a Saturn time, it was inevitable that the wounds of the man, Amfortas, who had failed to abide rightly by the Grail, should burn more fiercely. Think of the what, but still more of the how. For it is not a question of characterizing such things with the words I have been using, or with any words. There is no way of approach to the Grail through words of any kind, or through philosophical speculations. The only way is by changing all these words into feeling, by becoming able to feel in the Grail the sum of all that is holy, by feeling the confluence of that which came over from the moon period, appearing first in the Earth Mother Eve, and then newly in the Virgin Mother, of the Yahweh God who became ruler of the earth, and of the coming of the Christ being, who poured himself into the earth's aura and became the new Lord of the earth, by feeling the confluence of that which works down from the stars and is symbolized in the stellar script with human evolution on earth. If one takes all this into account and feels it as the consonance of human history with the stellar script, then one also grasps the secret that was to be expressed in the words entrusted to Parsifal in the saga. That whenever a king of the Grail, a truly appointed guardian of the Grail, dies, the name of his accredited successor appears on the Holy Grail. Quote, "There it is to be read," close quote, which means that it will be necessary to learn to read the stellar script again in a new form. Let us try to make ourselves worthy to do this. Let us try to read the stellar script in the form now given to us. For in fact, it is nothing else than a reading of the script which we try to trace out when we try to trace out human evolution through the Saturn, Sun, and Moon periods, right up to the Vulcan period. But we must recognize in what connection we wish to decipher the stellar script today. Let us make ourselves worthy of it. For not in vain are we told that the Grail was at first carried away from its own place, and for a season was not externally perceptible. Let us regard what we are permitted to study in our anthroposophy as a renewed seeking for the Grail. And let us try to learn to understand the significance of that which formerly spoke as though out of the subconscious depths of the soul and rose gradually into the consciousness of men. Let us try to transform that by degrees into a new and more conscious language. Let us try to explore a wisdom which will disclose to us the connection between the earthly and the heavenly, not relying on old traditions, but in accordance with the way in which it can be revealed today. And then let us be filled with the feeling of how it was that Parsifal came to the secret of the Grail. Afterward, the secret was kept hidden again, because men had first to seek for the connection of the earth with cosmic powers in the most external field, the field of the most external science. Let us also understand how it was that a spirit such as Kepler's could in the meantime come to grasp what he set out in his mathematical mechanical laws of the heavens. But what he added to this, being truly penetrated with the Christ impulse, had to sink back into the subconscious depths of the soul. When we express what we know how to say today about our earth evolution and its connection with the cosmos, we are speaking in Kepler's sense. Thus, we have heard him say, quote, "Thus, for example, in the cosmos there are three things at rest: the sun, the fixed stars, and the intermedium, and all else is in movement. And so, in the one God, our Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The sphere represents the Trinity. The Father is the center, the Son the surface, and the Holy Spirit the uniformity of the distance from center to surface, the radius. And so it is with other mysteries. Without spirits and souls, there would not be harmony everywhere. In human souls we find harmonious predispositions of an endlessly varied kind. The whole earth is ensouled, and thus the great harmony is brought about, not only on earth, but between the earth and the constellations. This soul works throughout the body of the earth, but it has its seat in a particular place, just as the human soul has its seat in the heart. And from this place, as though from a focus or source, its workings go out into the ocean and the atmosphere. Hence the sympathy between the earth and the stars, hence the regularity of nature's processes. The fact that the earth truly has a soul is shown most clearly by observing weather conditions and the aspects under which they habitually occur. Under certain aspects and constellations, the air is always restless. If such aspects are not present or are few or transient, the air remains quiet. These and countless other changes and phenomena which take place on the earth are so exact and regular that they cannot be ascribed to a blind cause. And since the planets themselves know nothing of the angles which their rays make with the earth must have a soul. The earth is an animal. One can observe in the earth a complete analogy with the parts of an animal body. Plants are its hair, metals are its veins, the waters of the sea are its drink. The earth has a formative power, a kind of imagination. It has movement, certain illnesses, and ebb and flow are its respirations. The soul of the earth seems to be a kind of flame, hence the subterranean warmth and the fact that without warmth there is no propagation. A certain image of the zodiac and of the whole firmament is imprinted by God in the soul of the earth." Close quote. We see today how this picture of the zodiac has been imprinted in the soul of the earth, the aura of the earth. And let us work gradually toward the other part of Kepler's world picture, the part which had to remain in the subconscious depths of the soul, but shows clearly that what we can give today as a cosmology is a fulfillment of it. Just as our anthroposophy, or what anthroposophy should mean to us, must be deeply grounded in the evolution of humanity, so is it inwardly connected with the admonition which resounds to us from the Holy Grail. And if we look at Europe, the western land of ancient times, and see what memories of the Atlantean epoch lived on into post-Atlantean times, if we see how in the Greek world a last faint echo sounded, showing how the Nathan Jesus had once been permeated by the Christ in the higher worlds, the Jesus who then descended and accomplished the mystery of Golgotha, then if we follow that out, we may ask, whence did the Christ come? How did he come when he came from on high to be the Lord of the earth? He passed from the west to the east, and from the east he returned to the west. His external physical covering came down from the realm of the higher hierarchies. The beings of those hierarchies brought it down. It belonged to them. The Parsifal saga reminds us of this in a beautiful way when it says, quote, "A host of angels brought to Titterel the Holy Grail, the true mystery of the Christ Jesus, of the connection between the Lord of the earth and the Virgin Mother. And a host of angels awaits it again in the realm of the higher hierarchies." Close quote. Let us seek it there, and then we shall gradually come to understand what our anthroposophical world conception is seeking. We shall gradually press on further and further toward a feeling, a perception of the celestial aspect of the Holy Grail, and thence to its human aspect, to the Mother with the Jesus, the Christ. Thus we have tried to point the way a little into the realm of human history, insofar as human history is sustained by spiritual powers. And if you have perceived something of what I wish to arouse through my words, not only in your thoughts, but in your feeling, the aim of this cycle of lectures will have been achieved. I could quite as well have called it, quote, "Concerning the Search for the Holy Grail," close quote. It can be left to each individual to judge whether the religious faiths scattered over the earth will one day find themselves in agreement with what is here meant by the harmony of all religions. And he can decide also whether what should be understood by the unity of religions is not more closely related to the secret of the Holy Grail, as we have tried to describe it. Then is a great deal of talking about the unity of religions, which may in fact be about something quite different. Anyone who wishes to hold fast to a narrow creed will certainly not be immediately convinced by what has been said. This is because he pays heed to the superficial course of events, and so to the external aspect of the real deeds of Christ, which are themselves of a spiritual nature. How a man was led by his karma to the spiritual deeds of Christ, how Parsifal was driven along this path, wherein is prefigured the unity of religions on earth, that is what we have wished to bring before our souls. And we should keep in mind that continuation of the Parsifal saga, which says that when the Grail became invisible in Europe, it was carried to the realm of Prester John, who had his kingdom on the far side of the lands reached by the Crusaders. In the time of the Crusades, the kingdom of Prester John, the successor of Parsifal, was still honored, and from the way in which search was made for it, we must say, if all this were expressed in terms of strict earthly geography, it would show that the place of Prester John is not to be found on earth. Footnote: the editors of the latest German edition, 1960, call attention to the probability of certain gaps in the existing shorthand report of this concluding paragraph. End of footnote. Was that meant to be a hint in the European saga that continued the Parsifal saga, that since then, without our being conscious of it, the Christ has been working in the hidden depths of the East? That the religious controversies which take their course on the conscious level in the East could be assuaged by the outflowings and revelations of the true Christ impulse, as was meant to happen, in accordance with the Parsifal revelation in the West? Was the sunlight of the Grail called upon to shine above all other gods on earth, as is symbolically indicated by the fact that when the maiden carried in the gold-gleaming vessel with the secret of the Grail within it, the radiance of the Grail outshone the other lights? Ought we to expect, quite contrary to current beliefs, that the Christ power, still working unconsciously, will appear in a changed form, and as ex orienta lux, in the old phrase, will meet with that which has appeared as light in the West? Should one light be able to unite with the other light? But for that it will be necessary for us to be prepared, we who are placed by karma in the geographical and cultural environment over which passed the path of the Christ, when in higher realms he had permeated Jesus of Nazareth in order to journey to the east. Let us look up and feel that the Christ passed through our heights before he was revealed on earth. Let us make ourselves capable of so understanding him that we shall not misunderstand what he will perhaps be able to say to us one day, when the time has come for his impulses to flow through other earthly creeds. That's the end of Lecture 6, and the end of the cycle Christ and the Spiritual World, the Search for the Holy Grail. And this was given in Leipzig from the 28th of December 1913 to the 2nd of January 1914.